It began with clumsy ink and carved wooden blocks, and ended by reshaping the entire world. Before books could whisper their stories into our hands, every page was born through pain, patience, and parchment. Tonight, let's turn back time, not with a bang, but with the gentle creak of a wooden press, the soft scratch of movable type being arranged by candlelight, and the quiet revolution that let ideas travel farther than armies. This is the story of how bedtime reading became possible. If you find comfort in the slow unfolding of human ingenuity, one letter at a time, then subscribe, like this video, and tap the bell icon for more sleepy stories. From Gutenberg's dreams to the printing press's quiet legacy, let this tale drift through ink and slumber alike. If you want to understand the printing press, you begin not with metal letters or a screw press, but with paper and wood. You begin with fiber soaked in vats, with hands dipping frames into pulp, and with the smell of damp sheets drying in long, quiet rooms. You begin with the steady, unhurried patience of people who knew that most important changes in human life come from small motions repeated 100,000 times, lifting a mold, draining it, smoothing a felt, pressing out water, and then peeling away a sheet so thin you could almost see your breath through it. You begin with workers who did not speak in grand theories about information or revolutions, but who checked the edge of a knife, felt the grain of a plank, and tied bundles with twine in the late afternoon. You begin, in other words, at the place where all printed knowledge must meet the simplest material facts: the right surface, the right ink, the right pressure, the right amount of time. You can picture the workshop as a place organized by rhythm rather than speed. In one corner, a vat of pulp catches the light, its surface pearly and faintly grey. Fibers from mulberry bark or hemp and sometimes scraps of rag have been beaten and rinsed until they surrender their structure and float as a suspension. A worker draws a wooden frame topped with a fine screen through the liquid, lifts it, and lets the water drain. This is not innovation at the pace of a manifesto. This is craft at the pace of a heartbeat. The sheets are laid in stacks, interleaved with felts and moved under weight, the excess water squeezed away. Later they are brushed onto walls or boards, dried by air, and then sized with a solution meant to give the surface the right balance between absorbency and resistance, enough to take ink sharply, not so much that strokes blur into feathery darkness. These are the dull details, perhaps, but in them you feel the first quiet condition of printing, the promise that a mark can be made once and repeated thousands of times if the surface holds still. Before movable type, the earliest printed pages in East Asia came from woodblocks carved with care and patience, a mirror world of letters, characters, and small ornaments reversed into the grain. It is the most literal approach to duplication you can imagine. You carve what you want to appear, you ink the surface lightly, you press paper onto it, and you pull away the result. The block is the machine, and the proof of the machine is in the stability of the line. To turn words into boards requires both artistry and a tolerance for tedium. You select blocks from pear or other close-grained woods that can hold fine strokes without splintering. You plane the surface flat and true. You polish it with pumice, and then, with the assistance of pasted calligraphy as a guide, you begin to carve away everything that is not the letter. What remains is fragile, and yet the fragility is deceptive. A well-carved block, kept dry and cleaned carefully, can produce thousands of impressions before its lines lose their crispness. In an era before the smell of ink became a scent of city newsrooms, this was the smell of careful repetition. The ink itself is part of the quiet mystery. In one place it is a water-based mixture, lamp black suspended with glue. In another, an oil-based recipe, slower to dry but capable of clinging to types and taking on the fine edges of letters with more definition. With a woodblock, the lighter, more delicate ink often suits the task because the paper absorbs it in a soft wave and the block can be refreshed with a simple brush across the raised lines. The block feels alive under your hands, the shallow resistance of ink, the slight give of the paper as you press and lift. The gestures repeat until they become habit, and habit becomes a kind of grammar. No one here speaks of disruption, only of schedules, which sutras must be finished before the festival, which calendars before the new year, which primers before children gather at school. The products are ordinary and supremely important: almanacs, prayers, lists of names, simple handbooks. When people imagine printing as a sudden ignition, they forget how much of it was, at first, a matter of the civic and the devotional. The daily need to reissue forms and texts that lost nothing from being identical to their predecessors. Look more closely and you see the constraints hidden in the apparent simplicity. The woodblock must be carved anew for each page. A single book means many boards, each stored on shelves in a system that any modern warehouse would admire. A shop that produces multiple editions over years accumulates a forest of planks with characters marching across them in dense order. Catalogues are kept not so much for authors as for boards, the shelf where last year's almanac rests, the bundle of pages for the local gazetteer, the blocks for an elementary dictionary. You can imagine someone counting through the stacks by the glow of an oil lamp, checking for worms or warping. Every wooden page is a promise sunk into material. Once made, it is easier to reuse than to reinvent. The shape's not just output, but thought. The stability of forms and the imprints of tradition. The comfort of a configuration that has worked before. All of it grows naturally from a technology that favors replication with as little change as possible. The labor that holds this together is distributed along quiet lines. Someone cuts paper to size and ties it in reams. Someone stands near the ink and keeps the mixture at the right viscosity. Someone carries finished sheets to racks. Someone, more experienced, checks every 10th impression and discards the flawed ones. Meanwhile, in another room, the real difficulty rises like a distant hill, the act of carving itself. The calligraphy pasted to the block is a template, but the carver must navigate a perilous space between erasing too little and too much. The risk is a nick to the backbone of a character, a misjudged curve, an accidental island that creates a bubble of ink where none should be. The carver's hands, once steady, can repeat forms with breathtaking consistency, but fatigue is the natural enemy. Long days produce subtle errors, so the foreman watches for signs of flagging attention, not to scold, but to pace the work against the fallibility of muscle and nerve. You might be tempted to ask where invention enters such a scene, and the answer would simply be this. Innovation is often hidden in the humblest adjustments. A slightly different sizing for the paper makes a summer edition less prone to smudge. A modified bar, used to rub impressions across the back of the paper, reduces the strain on wrists and spreads pressure more evenly. A small change in the grain orientation of a block reduces warping in the rainy season. These are not world historical shifts, but cumulative changes that make a shop more reliable, a book more legible, a calendar more trusted. In a society that depends on the accurate copying of bureaucratic directives, exam primers, temple registers, and genealogies, reliability is a form of public peace. The press, before it is a device, is a discipline. It helps to remember the context into which these pages entered. In a world of scholars and officials trained to prize calligraphy, the printed page was initially a compromise between the prestige of the handwritten and the practicality of multiplication. Printing introduced a new relationship between the ideal form of a character and the real world of copies. A famous hand could be pasted onto a block so that its elegance would pass into the carved lines, offering readers a standardized beauty. At the same time, printing flattened the hierarchy of script by making a single style travel farther, so that a rural reader encountered the same prim, upright characters as someone in a capital city. Standardization is a quiet power. It acts in the background, altering assumptions about what a page should look like, which forms are correct, and how a text should be encountered. Of course, the wood block carried within it the hint of a limitation. Every page, once carved, was fixed. Revision meant recarving. Error correction was costly. New editions needed not just an editor's pen, but a carver's blade. The idea of a system that could assemble characters from a stock and then disassemble them, the idea of movable type, arose naturally when people weighed cost against flexibility. In theory, characters could be cast or cut individually, set into place, inked, and then reused. In practice, at least in these early workshops, the count of characters posed a challenge that tells you something about the nature of language. A phonetic alphabet of a few dozen letters lends itself to rearrangement readily. A logographic system with thousands of characters demands an inventory that threatens to swallow all the space in the shop. And yet experiments were not rare. Artisans tried cutting characters from wood or clay, even casting them in metal, arranging them in trays, learning the new skill of typesetting, finding the right piece among thousands, speedily and without error. Imagine the typesetter's station as a cabinet of stories no one else would notice. Drawers sorted not by aesthetic preference, but by the stubborn facts of frequency, the characters most used in larger bins near hand, the rare ones tucked away in smaller nests like seldom used spices. Fingers learn their ranges the way a musician's hands learn the keyboard. The work is not glamorous. It is the kind of task that turns knowledge into muscle memory. To set even a small page is to move through decisions that happen almost too quickly to register. Not just which character, but which size, not just which size, but which cut, until finally the line fits, the weight balances, and the margins hold a quiet symmetry that an attentive eye appreciates without remarking. If you are tempted to romanticize, pause and consider the blemishes that define the real. The ink sometimes pools in a corner of a character, leaving a darker bulb. The paper, in a humid afternoon, curls slightly at the edge, and someone must smooth it before the impression. The block chuckles faintly against the table when a knot in the wood meets the tool. These small interruptions repeated over years teach an apprentice what every master already knows. Perfection is an idea with no workshop address. The aim is not to banish error absolutely, but to understand and corral it until it behaves. That is why checking finished sheets becomes a ritual. Someone flips through the pages whispering and removes the flawed ones with a kind of antiseptic mercy. The discarded stack is not wasted. It becomes scrap, used to test a new batch of ink or to wrap small goods for delivery. In that way, the shop becomes a small economy, nothing wasted if it can be repurposed. The subjects printed tell their own story about the purpose of the craft. Religious texts were early and constant companions to the block. Prayers and sutras lent themselves to standardization and wide circulation. Calendars and almanacs were as indispensable as a map is today, specifying lunar phases, lucky days, agricultural guidance, and official observances. Practical manuals on medicine, agriculture, etiquette, arithmetic found readers everywhere. County and local histories, often updated with new officials and notable families, gave people a sense of belonging to a place larger than their household. The print shop fed the appetites of the ordinary, for consistency, for shared knowledge, for reassurance in the form of regular publication. Hour after hour, day after day, these pages left the bench and went into the world, pasted on walls, bound as simple stitched books rolled into tubes or folded into packets tied with string. You might expect all this to happen in quiet isolation, but the shop lived in a larger web. The paper came in from mills often located near good water and suitable stands of mulberry. The wood arrived from carpenters who understood which trees yielded the best boards. Ink sticks traveled from workshops that specialized in soot and glue formulations. Distributors and hawkers knew which neighborhoods wanted more calendars and which preferred tiny primers for children. Officials sometimes placed orders for standard forms or proclamations, and those jobs could sustain a shop through lean seasons. When the time came to deliver finished work, A boy might load bundles onto a simple cart and follow a route known by heart. Past the bridge, up the hill, left at the market, right at the temple, and into the courtyard of a bookseller who kept his own careful ledger. In that ledger, money is only one column. Credit and reputation occupy others, less visible but equally decisive. Sometimes the shop took on a commission that required special handling, a family printing a genealogical record with updated entries, or a scholar preparing a text with unusual characters. In those moments, the limits of the woodblock showed themselves again. Rare characters required ad hoc solutions, sometimes including cutting a special piece and pasting it onto the block or carving a small insert. The carver's knife had to imitate the scholar's brush, and that imitation revealed the delicate balance between machine and hand. Printing is a mechanical process that constantly gestures toward the art that preceded it. It preserves the look of handwriting even as it transforms it into a repeatable pattern. The viewer knows, if only subconsciously, that a page comes from a block, but the eye still wanders over strokes as if they were formed in a single breath. All this set the stage for what would come later. New materials, new arrangements of letters, new economies, but from the vantage point of this first long chapter, you feel how much of printing's power sprang from ordinary endurance. The transformation of culture is often credited to dazzling invention, and there was plenty of that. Yet the decisive factor, the one that made printing a force rather than a curiosity, was the willingness of countless people to attend to dull details. They sharpened knives and replaced warped blocks. They dried paper in bad weather with patience. They stirred ink when it thickened. They checked page after page until the pile of acceptable copies grew and the flawed ones dwindled. Systems are built from such work, and systems, in turn, make possible the wide flow of ideas that seem at a distance, so sudden and inevitable as you stand in this imagined workshop. Following the routine, you notice one more thing: change. When it comes, rarely announces itself. A visiting artisan might demonstrate a different way to set type, showing the advantage of reusable characters for correcting errors quickly. A scholar might bring a calligraphic hand that once transferred to blocks becomes a new standard for primers. A supplier might switch to a slightly different fiber source, producing paper with a smoother finish that suddenly makes fine strokes clearer. None of these feels like a revolution in the moment. All of them become, in retrospect, the quiet steps by which printing moves from one stage to another. And that leads you toward the question that hangs in the air as the day lengthens and the last sheets are hung to dry. Given a craft so thoroughly shaped by repetition and material constraints, how did the promise of movable type and eventually the press, as you may picture it, take hold in a way that would alter the rhythm of workshops like this one forever? You step back into the workshop, but the air is different now. The block is not the only instrument in the room. On one bench, trays are divided into small compartments. They hold tiny pieces that look unremarkable unless you know what they are. Individual characters, each one a small world of strokes and spaces carved or molded and ready to be placed in a line. The idea of movable type feels simple when you hear it. Take the components of writing and make them reusable. But simplicity in concept often hides complexity in execution. You start to notice the quiet arithmetic of it. Not only how many different characters you need to cover the full range of text, but how many copies of the most common ones you must have to set a page quickly. The problem shifts from carving one perfect page to organizing 10,000 small pieces so that fingers can find them, return them, and find them again without friction. You hear names that carry the weight of firsts. A craftsman experiments with baked clay characters pressed from small molds. Clay is humble, abundant, and easy to shape, but that is both its strength and its weakness. In the hands of a careful worker, it produces crisp strokes and straight edges. Under pressure and moisture, it chips and crumbles. Still, the principle is proven. Individual signs can be assembled, locked into a frame, inked, and impressed onto paper. When the job is done, the frame is unlocked The characters return to their compartments, and the shop carries on. The lesson seems almost philosophical. The permanence of writing does not require the permanence of the tool that makes it. What matters is repeatability under ordinary conditions, not the material's grandeur. Metal draws the eye next. Bronze is difficult to shape at small scales but strong, and when cast from a well-cut matrix, it yields characters that endure. Casting itself becomes a small science. You need a master pattern, a punch, a mold that can withstand heat and permit fine detail, and then you need consistency in the pour so that one batch matches the next, closely enough that lines of text do not wobble across a page. In a shop where wood blocks once sufficed, this introduces new trades: a caster who understands temperature and flow, a cutter who can create punches with uncompromising accuracy, and a typesetter whose quick fingers learn the new geography of compartments and bins. If the block once demanded the meditative patience of carving away what is not needed, the typecase demands a new kind of attentiveness, locating a piece among thousands, balancing lines with spaces, and anticipating how ink will sit on metal rather than wood. You can feel in this shift how tools invite new habits. A block begins its life as a page, whole and integrated. The typecase begins its life as parts destined to be assembled. A block carries the memory of a specific edition and invites reuse of the whole. The typecase carries the memory of frequency, not sequence, asking you to think in terms of which characters will be needed most often and in what sizes. The type compositor's day develops a different cadence: arrange, lock, ink, print, unlock, return. In that routine, errors that were once carved permanently can be corrected by exchanging a single character. A transposed sign or an omitted particle no longer requires a new block. It demands attention and a change of pace. The gain in flexibility is immediate and satisfying, but you sense the limits too. The number of distinct characters remains a constant pressure. An alphabet with 24 letters plus punctuation and diacritics can be held in a few shallow drawers. A logographic system with thousands of signs spreads out like a city. The most frequent characters must be multiplied in proportion to their use, and the rarer ones must still be available somewhere, labeled perhaps, and stored like the odd-shaped tool that a carpenter reaches for only once a season. Organizing becomes its own discipline. The shop invents a geography of the typecase, the layout guided by frequency lists, by conventional radicals, or by phonetic matches to reduce hunting time. Apprentices begin by learning the map, not the metal. Their hands memorize routes the way feet memorize neighborhood streets. As the technique settles, you notice a pattern that might surprise you if you expected a technology to triumph purely because it is new and clever. Woodblock printing does not vanish. In fact, it continues to thrive in many places, especially where editions are large and stable. A block, once carved, promises page consistency across thousands of impressions without the need to reset type for each run. It is particularly effective for texts that do not change across editions or for illustrated materials where image and text must be harmonized precisely. The block embodies a certain kind of certainty. Movable type offers a certain kind of flexibility. The workshop, which is also a business, chooses between them based on the nature of the job. A new primer with expected revisions next year benefits from type. A canonical text to be issued in large numbers benefits from wood. This choice has consequences beyond the bench. A shop equipped for type needs capital invested in matrices, punches, and cases, and it needs staff trained to handle setup and tear down. A shop dedicated to woodblock requires fewer specialized tools, but more carving skill and storage space for the blocks. The economics of paper and ink are their own background hum, but here you feel how the organization of labor shapes paths that look, from a distance, like the evolution of ideas. A state bureau tasked with issuing forms in regular cycles may opt for typesetting to correct small changes quickly. A temple entrusted with the preservation and distribution of a sacred canon may invest in the painstaking perfection of blocks to ensure visual uniformity and textual stability. The same technology that frees one kind of text from rigidity serves another kind's appetite for continuity. Your attention shifts to an extraordinary demonstration of endurance, the effort to compile and print vast collections of sacred texts and legal codes. It is one thing to imagine a single shop. It is another to imagine the coordination of many, guided by scholars and officials, animated by the belief that the right words, accurately transmitted, can anchor a community or a state. In these projects, the daily life of printers intersects with the daily life of bureaucrats and clergy. Colophons become small bottlings of time, lists of who supervised the edition, who carved the blocks when certain volumes were finished, and sometimes the weather or the auspices under which an undertaking began. You realize that the printed book does not merely carry text. It carries the social memory of the act of printing. The identity of workers is recorded with a gravity that is not fame, but duty. Surrounding all this is the geography of commerce. Paper mills cluster near clear running water and stands of fast-growing trees whose fibers yield a strong, supple sheet. Ink makers establish reputations by the clarity of their blacks and the way their mixture behaves in dry or humid weather. Merchants learn which neighborhoods consume which kinds of texts. You can picture a cart rolling into a town market at dawn, the driver knowing which stallholders will take a stack of calendars, which school wants a bundle of elementary readers, which local landholder has requested a freshly updated genealogy. The rhythm of editions reveals itself in the seasons. Spring brings almanacs and planting guides. Summer, instruction manuals for irrigation and pest control. Autumn, examination primers. Winter, religious recitations and household registers. Through it all, the techniques of printing, block and type, wood and metal, sit not at the center, but as the reliable background. The way a loom sits in a weaver's house. You think about the aesthetic dimension, which is never entirely separate from the practical. In the carving of blocks or the casting of type, the form of characters is not purely functional. It carries values. Printed pages reflect a standard of what writing should look like. Schools and scholars may prefer a sober, upright face that encourages clarity. Storytellers and entertainers may prefer a livelier line. At times, a particularly admired hand becomes the source for a whole generation's printed form. In that way, printing can paradoxically preserve the individuality of a brush while standardizing it into reproducible parts. The tension between the living variation of handwriting and the fixed repetition of type persists. It is not a struggle that demands a winner so much as a dialogue that never ends. On another bench, you see proofs that look faintly wrong to your eye. The issue is not the characters, but the alignment. Lines dip or rise unpredictably, the result of an uneven lockup. To correct it, someone loosens the frame, slides tiny slips of paper or thin strips of metal, furniture, as printers will call it, between lines, and tightens again. The sound of the screw settling into firmness is satisfying, like a lid fitting a jar. At the inking station, another person worries the mixture, testing it with a fingertip for tack and flow. Metal type, you learn, prefers a slightly different ink from the woodblock, one that sits on the surface rather than soaking in too deeply, so that fine lines do not thicken as the paper drinks. Even the motion of inking changes. A soft dab with a pad or a roller, not a brush, yields a consistent layer over raised surfaces without flooding valleys. In all of this, error is teacher and enemy. Misfiled characters produce misspellings that escape the eye. A tiny burr on a metal piece leaves a hairline of unwanted ink. A small warp in the frame causes the impression to be faint on one side. So the shop invents routines that would be at home in any modern production floor. Double checks and cross reads, not because anyone is distrustful, but because attention is a finite resource. Everyone touches a page in some way before it leaves. The setter, the inker, the pressman, the proofreader, and sometimes a supervisor who signs off in pencil on the back. When the work is steady and ordinary, this can seem dull. That is the point. Dullness is a form of reliability when you repeat it across years. Meanwhile, outside the shop, the presence of printing begins to shape how people learn. Teachers know that students can acquire the same primer across towns. Exam candidates develop expectations about the wording and order of model essays. Householders become accustomed to consulting the same format calendars each year, turning to familiar places for moon phases, tide tables, or advice on auspicious days. Booksellers become curators not just of content but of format. A buyer might ask not merely for a title but for an edition with a particular type size or a preferred page layout. That market feedback loops back into the shop. A popular format tends to become a standard, and standardization reduces cost and error. You recognize that the story of printing is inseparable from the story of taste, and taste, once shaped, becomes a quiet kind of law. At moments, you find yourself asking a question that historians often pose in different words. If movable type offers such powerful flexibility, why does the woodblock persist so strongly in many places? The answer resides in the ratio of effort to reward for each kind of text. For a single sheet bearing an announcement, a form, or a calendar, something that will be reissued with small changes, typesetting shines. For large, long works that will be printed repeatedly without alteration, the block is incomparable. It stores form as matter, requiring only storage space and care. Add to that the fact that wood and skill were locally available in many towns, while the capital and expertise for casting and maintaining type were not. You see a technological landscape that is less a staircase than a field of choices. No single path claims universal superiority. Instead, each presses its advantages quietly where conditions suit. In a corner, a young apprentice recites aloud the names and positions of characters in the cases. The cadence is like learning the order of stars. Next to him stands a master who has carved blocks for 40 years, his hands bearing the faint, shiny burnish that comes from handling wood and oil. The elder respects the new method and uses it when appropriate. The younger respects the old and understands why the block endures. Neither treats the other as obsolete. What they share is a sense that the page must be clear, consistent, and worthy of the reader's patience. That is the governing practicality. When you have worked with ink long enough, you stop treating tools as ideologies and treat them as instruments tuned to jobs. By day's end, sheets of both kinds lie drying. The room smells of glue and smoke and wet fiber, and the sound is the same as ever, low, steady, punctuated by the occasional clink of metal on metal or the grate of a blade being honed. You think of the larger currents, scholarship, devotion, commerce, that these sheets serve. They do not have to be dramatic to be important. They have to be correct, legible, and on time. As the door closes and the cooling air moves through the racks, you are left with a question ripening like fruit on a high branch. When these methods and habits traveled, as techniques and materials often do, how did they change shape in new hands? And what rhythms, block or type, wood or metal, would survive the passage into other languages, other markets and other visions of what a page should be? You begin this last part not in a single workshop, but on the long roads that bind them. Fiber becomes paper in one region. Knowledge of paper moves along with merchants and envoys to another. The path is not a single line, but a mesh of routes across valleys, deserts, and seas. You imagine paper traveling first, because without a good surface, there is no printing worth the name. The craft follows the flow of rivers and the convenience of mills. It lodges where water is clean and controllable, where plants fit for pulping are nearby, and where labor can be trained in repetitive tasks that demand steadiness. The feel of a good sheet becomes a shared standard among people who have never met. When you hold a page to the light and see the faint watermark of a screen's weave or the pattern left by a drying board, you are reading not only the text, but the infrastructure that made the text possible. Printing, when it moves, adapts itself to the social scaffolding it finds. In one place, the state supports large-scale editions, aligning the craft with bureaucratic needs and ritual calendars. In another, private shops flourish, clustering near markets where demand for primers, storybooks, and almanacs ebbs and flows with the seasons. The people who make this work possible are not only the artisans at the bench, but also the carriers who know the distances between towns in days, the clerks who keep accounts of cash and credit, the scribes who prepare clean copy for carving, and the proofreaders whose eyes are sharpened by the habit of catching errors others miss. When you talk about the history of the printing press, you risk letting machines overshadow human constellations. But the work is held up by networks of obligation and skill that matter as much as any tool. In some places, the page bends toward the devotional. Whole collections of sacred writings are printed as acts of merit, preservation, and instruction. The scale of such undertakings pushes the craft to its limits. Blocks fill shelves. Editions run for years. The flaws of earlier volumes are quietly corrected in later impressions. The act of printing sacred text turns shops into places where time is layered. You might open a volume and find at the end a small note that tells you which sponsors paid for the carving of those pages, which workers did the labor, and when. That little note pulls your mind down from the grand narrative, the spread of ideas, the endurance of institutions, and anchors it in particular hands at a particular bench. The more you look, the more you see that history is always local, even when its consequences are vast. Elsewhere, the page bends toward instruction. Study guides, model essays, and exam manuals create a shared classroom that stretches across provinces. The printed format of a text is part of its teaching. The order of sections tells students how to order their thoughts. The standard characters teach the eye what to expect. The margins, sometimes left wide for notes, remind you that reading is a dialogue, not merely consumption. When thousands of students sit with the same printed pages, a common intellectual rhythm emerges. Teachers can assign lessons with greater confidence. Students can practice with materials that match the expectations of evaluators. The practical effects are immense and quietly transformative. Large bureaucratic systems depend on consistent training. Printing supplies the consistency. Then there is the page of entertainment and daily utility. Song sheets, story collections, medical tips, calendars, and how-to booklets. If you hold one of these, you feel the life of the marketplace. A seller calls out the novelty of a story. A household buys a calendar to pin to the wall. A farmer reads about a pest that devours a crop and tries the suggested remedy. The text here is not meant to outlast generations. It is meant to be useful for a season or two. It is printed quickly and cheaply, and it spreads habits and expectations that are not grand, but are decisive. Over time, the accumulation of such small texts changes what people think it is reasonable to know. A laborer can have access to a simple primer. A mother can keep a printed household guide. A shopkeeper can consult a printed table of measures. The floor of ordinary knowledge rises. The craft also passes between cultures, sometimes directly, sometimes by analogy. Consider how methods of carving and inking find new expressions in places where the layout of writing and the balance of text and image are different. In one city, artisans use woodblocks not just for text, but for imagery that shares a page with captions and poems, developing a style in which the cut line echoes the brushstroke. In another, typesetting coexists with engraving, the former handling the words, the latter handling the pictures, until composite pages weave them together. As techniques cross borders, they meet different alphabets or character sets, and the advantages shuffle. A consonant-heavy script might welcome the repeatable precision of metal. A character-rich system might remain faithful to wood for long works while using type for short notices and forms. The craft does not care about purity. It cares about fitness to task. Through all of this, you return to a question that nags at the edges. Did the knowledge of printing travel in a straight line from one region to another, shaping what came later, far away? The honest answer is that technologies often travel in parts. The idea of printing in a broad sense, the logic of putting inked relief against paper, can arise independently when surfaces and needs align. Meanwhile, the materials that support it, like paper and certain ink recipes, can spread widely. People observe one another's methods. A merchant mentions an unusual device in another town. An artisan visits a foreign workshop and notices the way a frame is tightened. The transfer rarely looks like a singular eureka. It looks like a gradual seasoning of practices. The result is a family resemblance, not an identical twin, between crafts in different places. When you widen the lens further, you notice how the craft interacts with authority. In one context, the state recognizes printing's power to standardize edicts, examinations, and calendars, and it takes an interest in regulating what can be printed and how. Licensing regimes arise to maintain quality and to control content. Official workshops coexist with private ones, sometimes in tension, sometimes in collaboration. In another context, the craft remains more in private hands, its growth guided by market demand, with regulation appearing mostly at the points where printed matter intersects with public order. Printers learn, as guilds everywhere do, that their security depends on reliability. Produce pages that do what they promise. Avoid errors that humiliate officials or mislead readers. Stay within the understood bounds of the acceptable. These are not lofty ideals. They are straightforward strategies for survival. At the level of raw process, you keep noticing small, practical details that would never make a monument but do make a craft. A block must be stored away from damp or it will warp. A typecase must be shielded from dust, or the tiny spaces between pieces will fill with grit that shows up as dirty prints. A ream of paper must be acclimated to the room before printing, or sheets will change size with humidity and misregister. Workers improvise with what they have. A tool handle is wrapped with cloth to reduce blisters. A drying room is lined with straw mats to moderate the air. A proofreader uses a straight reed to guide the eye line by line. These are the things that never appear in grand summaries, but are the lifeblood of the shop. If you have ever learned any craft yourself, you can feel the kinship. There is also failure, the kind that accumulates quietly. A chest of type falls and spills, mixing compartments that took months to organize. A set of blocks swells in a flood and becomes useless. Copies have to be made from volumes saved on higher shelves. A batch of ink is bad. It looks fine in the jar, but dries to a faint grey that the customer rejects. In response, practices harden. Typecases gain lids. Blocks are stored on platforms to keep them off the floor. Inkmakers earn or lose trust. The craft becomes more conservative, not because people dislike change, but because they have learned what the failure of a small part does to the whole. This conservatism is not a political stance. It is a recognition that many interdependent details must align for a sheet to leave the shop with a clean face. Now, at the edge of this story, you look toward the westward horizon where other workshops will soon echo similar sounds. The root of knowledge there is tangled with the route of materials. Paper, once made locally, becomes a standard medium across large regions, and with it comes the possibility of printing as a trade, not just as a curiosity. Yet what will take root in those places will depend on the language, the market, and the tools that local artisans can either copy or invent. A screw press is a simple machine once you know it. But deciding to build one and to make letters in metal that can be set and reset requires a cluster of competencies: metallurgy, precision cutting, and a market hungry for repeatable pages. You cannot transplant craft like a plant in a single motion. You move its seeds and see where they germinate. If you listen closely to your own expectations, you might notice a bias that favors the dramatic: one inventor, one moment, one machine. But standing among paper stains and type trays, you feel that the truth is more diffused. The craft described here shaped habits of reading that made other changes feasible. It made people comfortable with the idea that a page could look the same across distance, that a calendar could govern many villages at once, that shared primers could knit together a class of students who had never met. It taught the eye to expect regularity, and it taught the hand to create it. Those habits matter because they smooth the way for other routines when they arrive. A new press in another town enters a world already trained to recognize the virtues of the repeatable. You end with a last glance at the quiet legacies that outlast any single tool. A way of organizing work that reduces error. A set of customary page layouts that please the eye without effort. A chain of supply that keeps paper affordable and ink reliable. A shared sense that words deserve to be treated with care, and that care includes the small, dull decisions that make the difference between a readable page and a smudged one. These are the conditions into which any later machine will be born. They are the inheritance that whisper under the clatter of metal type and the creak of a press screw. And so, as the lamps are snuffed and the last printed sheets cool on their racks, you might ask yourself a simple, practical question that opens onto a wider world. When the craft crosses into a new market with different letters, different laws and different appetites, what does it keep from its past? What does it relinquish, and what, unseen at first, will it make possible next? You enter another workshop now, and the smell shifts from glue and smoke to oil and hot metal. The room is anchored by a device you may have seen in diagrams: a heavy frame, a screw descending to a platen, a bed on which a form of type will slide under pressure. The press is not large, but it is dense. It radiates the purposeful gravity of a machine that has found its task. All around, the instruments of a European type shop assemble themselves in your view. There are cases of type with compartments for letters, spaces, and punctuation. There are composing sticks, small, handheld frames in which a typesetter builds a line character by character. There are galleys for carrying assembled lines, chases, and coins for locking up pages, and small pots of an ink that gleams with a particular viscosity you recognize as oil-based. Everything in the room is designed to hold alignment under force. The key material difference announces itself in the alloy. The letters here are not carved from wood, nor pressed from clay. They are cast in a mixture that includes lead, tin, and antimony. Each component contributes a property the workshop needs. Lead melts easily and flows. Tin adds strength and sharpness to the edges. Antimony expands slightly upon cooling, allowing the cast letter to fill the mold and produce a crisp face. The combination is a minor marvel. It delivers pieces strong enough to withstand repeated pressings, yet soft enough to be remelted and recast when worn. Casting itself relies on two small but decisive inventions: a hand mold that can be adjusted for different widths, and a system of punches and matrices that standardizes the face. A master punch is cut in steel with a design of a letter in relief. That punch is struck into softer metal to create a matrix. The matrix is placed in the mold. Hot alloy is poured. A single uniform type is produced. Repeat this hundreds of thousands of times, and you have a font. You can hear the sound of it, a rhythm of casting, trimming, and sorting that furnishes the shop with the inventory it needs. Fonts are made not in decorative abundance, but in practical sufficiency. An alphabet in Latin script calls for both upper and lowercase letters, numerals, and marks, with many more copies of the most common letters, E, T, A, O, than the rarer ones. A type founder becomes a mathematician of frequency. He plans production based on what a compositor will reach for most often, replenishing drawers as they empty. The compositor, in turn, relies on consistency of body size, face, and alignment, so that lines justify with clean vertical edges. The aesthetic of the page, its claustral order, its columns, its justified margins, emerges from the mechanics of uniform units assembled with pressure. This is where the ink comes back into focus. The oil-based mixture, often made from soot, and varnish boiled from linseed oil, adheres to the metal face without bleeding into the paper. When the pressman lays the ink on with padded balls, or, later, rollers, the ink sits on the tiny raised surfaces of letters, forming a skin that transfers under pressure. The pressure is supplied by the screw and the platen. a controlled downward force that inks the paper evenly across the form. The movement is simple and repeatable. Pull the bed in, lower the platen with the turning of the bar, hold a count, raise it, slide the bed out, lift the printed sheet, lay a new one, re-ink, and continue. One press, 2 men, hundreds of impressions in a day. The number is not spectacular, but when multiplied across weeks and paired with the speed of typesetting and reuse, it yields a flow of pages that would have seemed astonishing to anyone used to the pace of hand copying. You are tempted to look for the singular spark, but what you see instead is the integration of many crafts. The precision of metal cutting is joined to the chemistry of ink, the making of paper to the engineering of the press. None of these skills is alien to the city. Blacksmiths, goldsmiths, and metalworkers know metallurgy. Makers of seals and coins know punching and die work. Presses already exist in other trades such as winemaking and papermaking. The genius of the shop is not the invention ex nihilo of each component, but the decision to bring them all to bear on the problem of reproducing text efficiently and legibly. That decision is perhaps the most ordinary kind of brilliance. Take what is already at hand in a place dense with crafts and align it with a market's needs. The market itself is visible in the choice of early products. Long, continuous texts with uniform pages suit the press. Liturgical books, Bibles, psalters, and indulgence forms meet steady demand. When a shop undertakes a grand project like a large Bible, the requirements test and harden every aspect of the craft. Typefaces must be designed to be readable in columns. Page layouts must reconcile the width of lines with the size of type and the expected annotations. The press must deliver consistent impressions over thousands of sheets. The workflow must handle corrections without scrambling the entire schedule. You witness the rise of proof stages, first roughs to catch gross errors, then corrected proofs for finer points. Marginal symbols note where lines were adjusted, where a letter was recast, where a coin slipped and a page printed slightly light in a corner. The idea of edition control, so familiar now, is born in the quiet notation of such things. Of course, the presence of a press is not a purely technical fact. It is a social fact. It requires capital, partnership, and risk management. Investors back a workshop. Masters train workers. Contracts are signed. Supplies are secured in bulk. Paper is expensive in large quantities. Ink, though cheaper, must be bought or prepared consistently. Type metal must be procured and recycled. And the tools of the trade, molds, punches, presses, are costly. Shops keep ledgers that balance sales against these outflows, and from the entries, you can infer the pressure to keep the press moving. Idle time is waste. That pressure drives the search for texts that will sell steadily. Standard works, legal texts, devotional books, and eventually grammars and school books that feed a growing hunger for literacy. Reliability for the reader is, at the same time, stability for the shop. Regulation appears early and comes in multiple forms. Guilds, city councils, and church authorities take notice of what the presses produce. On the one hand, there is admiration for the reduction of scribal error and the availability of texts. On the other, there is anxiety about the loss of control over content and interpretation. Licenses and privileges enter the scene, not solely as restrictions but also as protections. A printer may receive exclusive rights to produce a certain text for a period, shielding investment from immediate imitation. In exchange, authorities expect decorum and adherence to approved versions. The arrangement is mundane, a contract between innovation and order. It is replicated in different shapes across cities, each with its own mix of appetite and caution. In the daily life of the shop, you catch the small strategies that mark a mature routine. Type is divided into multiple sets so that one form can be on press while another is being composed and a third is being corrected. This concurrency keeps all parts of the operation busy. The pressman watches the wear on the timpan and the frisket, the frame and sheet that hold the paper, to prevent debris from imprinting the margins. A box of small, uniform strips sits ready to be slid under low spots in a form to correct impression. The compositor keeps an eye on the white, the spaces between words and the leading between lines, so that justified text does not form rivers that distract the eye. You notice how much of printing's aesthetic comes from the pursuit of a functional stability under force. As volumes leave the press, binding becomes the next quiet decision point. Not all pages are bound the same day or in the same shop. Some customers prefer to purchase sheets and have them bound by their own artisans, choosing covers and clasps that match a library's style. Others buy ready-bound volumes. Binderies develop formats that cater to use. Heavy boards and strong sewing for large books that will be consulted often. Simpler wrappers for pamphlets and ephemera. The printed page enters the life of readers only when the binding supports the way they will handle it. The workshop may not bind, but it prints with binding in mind, leaving margins for the sewing and expecting certain stresses at the fold. You might expect that readers are immediately comfortable with the printed page, but habits adjust slowly. The regularity of type, the uniformity of lines, the recurrence of page forms, all of these train expectations over time. Some miss the individual hand of a scribe and the marginal glosses that grew organically from it. Others welcome the clarity and speed. In response, printers experiment with formats that echo familiar features, rubrication and hand-added initials in early copies, printed guide letters for later decoration, and page layouts that preserve spaces for commentary. You see here a negotiation between continuity and change, a deliberate gentleness that eases readers into a new normal. Behind the visible production remains the unromantic care of tools. The press screw needs lubrication and attention to wear. The bed must remain true and unwarped. The type must be distributed back into cases without mixing fonts and sizes. The hand mold is cleaned and inspected regularly. Matrices are stored with a conservator's caution. If anything in this chain is neglected, the degradation shows in subtle ways first. Letters grow fuzzy, lines fail to align, ink begins to show stippling where the face has pitted. The master printer knows the signs the way a farmer knows the weather. He schedules maintenance as surely as he schedules jobs, because maintenance is not optional. It is the guardian of reputation. You watch a customer arrive with a manuscript tucked into a wrapper. It is not a grand work, but a useful one, a grammar perhaps, or a manual of accounts. The negotiation is practical. The printer estimates the length, the number of sheets at the chosen format, the time needed to set and correct, the number of impressions expected in the first run, and the cost. A down payment is made. The manuscript passes to the shop's corrector, who marks ambiguities and standardizes spelling where appropriate. The typesetter begins, and the author may be called in to answer questions. At each stage, the relationship is not between genius and machine. It is between a client and a crew of skilled workers who translate handwriting into a durable public face. That translation gives the author a reach he would not otherwise have, but it also subjects his words to the discipline of a format. Standing near the door as the light fades, you are aware that this room has quietly changed the shape of time for people who live with books. Production schedules exist. Deadlines are not merely hopes. They are commitments tied to payments and to market windows. The season of a fair, the rhythm of a liturgical year, the cycle of a school term, these become anchoring points for when a text must be ready. You can feel the pressure not as a heroic rush, but as a steady insistence. Keep the press moving, keep the cases organized, keep the schedule realistic, and keep the quality high. It is an ethic that leaves little room for drama and much room for procedural pride. As you turn to leave, you frame the question that will carry you forward. In a world now served by presses like this, how do the people who run them balance two imperatives that can pull in different directions? The desire to flood the market with reliable copies and the need to exercise judgment about what deserves the weight and cost of type? You stand by the press as the day begins before sunrise, because the press does not care about the clock on the wall. It cares about paper that must be dry and ink that must be ready. The pressmen have a ritual that looks unremarkable unless you have watched it enough to see how it knits a business together. The timpan and frisket are inspected, the packing beneath the timpan adjusted so that the pressure will be even, the form of type checked for loose sorts that could tilt under force. Someone runs a hand over the surface to feel for a letter sitting proud, a tiny protrusion that could leave a crushing bruise called batter. Another person tests the ink balls, leather stuffed with wool, dabbed until their surface gives the right tack, and murmurs something about yesterday's varnish. All of this is routine, and all of it exists so that a sheet will leave the press with lines that are even and letters that are crisp. The unglamorous secret is that stability is not an accident. It is cultivated in small ways that vanish into the page. While the pressmen focus on the pull, you look at the composing room and see a different kind of attention. The compositor works with a composing stick in one hand, a case in front of him with compartments for letters. His eyes read the manuscript, but his fingers keep a separate score, selecting sorts, inserting spaces, occasionally checking a ligature that saves space and keeps letters from colliding. The stick fills up, the line is justified with thin spaces of metal or wood until it reaches the exact width, and then the line is slid out onto a galley. With enough lines, a page takes shape. The chase and quoins, frame and wedges, lock the page into a solid object that will resist the press. The labor is a constant translation from hand to machine and back again. In that translation, the shop must choose what to standardize and what to indulge. Spelling, for instance, tends to drift in manuscripts. The compositor, guided by house practice and the corrector's marginal marks, chooses consistency that will suit readers and prevent future confusion. This is where the business of pages reveals itself most clearly. A printer is not simply a craftsman. A printer is a scheduler and a negotiator. Contracts are the bone of the operation. If you lean over a ledger, you can follow the life of a project by the columns of dates and sums. A customer, perhaps an ecclesiastical office needing indulgence blanks or a university procuring a set of lectures, pays a deposit that ties the workshop to a delivery date. The printer estimates sheets, uses, and waste because paper is purchased in reams and there will always be spoilage. Sheets that smear, misprints, or paper ruined by a sudden change in humidity. The printer buys more paper than the perfect calculation requires. This is not pessimism, it is prudence. If a printer underestimates, the delay of securing more paper could collapse a delivery schedule. And schedules keep the press from idling. The question you carried from the first section, how to balance the wish to flood the market with reliable copies against the judgment of what deserves the cost of type, plays out in the quiet choices of the day. Early on, indulgence forms and small liturgical items provide steady income. They are quick to produce, and their demand is predictable. Then come larger works that build reputation, a psalter with robust musical notation, a grammar that teachers can trust, a calendar aligned with the needs of a diocese. The big ambitions, large Bibles, legal compendia, are gambles that will tie up type for months and require careful financing. A printer may seek investors for such undertakings, forming a partnership that spreads risk in exchange for profit and sometimes control. The famous disputes that echo through time, the clash between a visionary printer and his financier, come down in the ledgers to interest rates, collateral, and the value of equipment that does not itself produce pages unless the shop keeps moving. Privileged rights enter as both shield and spur. A city council or a sovereign grants a privilege for a particular book, a method, or a typeface. The promise is simple. For a span of years, no rival may copy this product in the jurisdiction. In return, the printer publishes at his own risk and adheres to standards of quality and decorum. The privilege is a line of defense for investment. It gives a printer the courage to lay out the money for materials and wages, knowing that imitation will be restrained. But privileges are bounded by city and region. Printers travel to fairs where sales happen across borders and enforcement is uneven. A shop must therefore protect itself by reputation as much as by law. If your pages are known to be clear, your editions reliable, your bindings sound, customers will seek you even when a cheaper version appears elsewhere. In printing, as in bread, the regulars will walk an extra street for a loaf they trust. Proofreading is a discipline that bridges the craft and the business because errors translate into cost. You watch a proof pass from compositor to corrector, marked with sigla that say more in a few strokes than a paragraph could. A reversed letter, a dropped word, a line spaced badly, a broken sort. All of these have signs. The corrector's eye trains itself on margins where typesetters are prone to slip. He knows, for example, that a tiny speck caught between the type and the paper will create a mysterious dot that the reader could mistake for a punctuation mark. He orders corrections, some in the stick, some in the chase, and occasionally he decides that the cost of disassembling a former to fix a minor flaw outweighs the benefit. The balance of perfection and practicality is measured in sheets. If a mistake is caught early, a stop-press correction prevents many bad copies. If it is caught late, a cancel leaf may be printed, a replacement page tucked into copies, often identifiable by its slightly different tone or texture. The printer must judge which course preserves both quality and solvency. What happens to the sheets after printing turns the shop into a small logistics firm. Sheets are piled with care, turned at intervals to prevent set-off, the transfer of wet ink to the sheet above. Once dry, they are folded into gatherings according to the chosen format. In folio, where a sheet is folded once to make 2 leaves. In quarto, folded twice for 4 leaves. In octavo, folded 3 times for 8 leaves, and so on. The signature marks at the bottom of the first recto of each gathering guide, binders in the correct order. And catchwords at the foot of pages carry the first word of the next page to help early readers and binders align sequences. These are the small conveniences that make the whole system robust. Every page carries instructions on how it fits into the larger map. Distribution rides the rhythms of fairs and roads. Booksellers and stationers, some independent, some closely tied to workshops, carry bundles to market towns. The big fairs are seasonal anchors where contracts are signed, orders placed, and payments settled, often in mixed currency that requires a clerk's neat arithmetic. A printer chooses which fairs to attend or which agents to trust, balancing reach against cost. Smaller loads move constantly, a messenger on horseback with a packet of indulgence forms for a distant parish, a wagon with crates of grammars for a school. The printer's relationship with stationers is not merely transactional, it is advisory. A stationer can tell a printer which texts have tested well with readers, which sizes move faster, whether a cheaper paper might serve a more price-sensitive audience, or whether a slightly larger type is worth the extra sheets for a text meant to be read by candlelight in poor conditions. Paper itself is not generic. A printer chooses between stocks by weight, color, and surface. Some paper is sized more heavily and takes ink cleanly for dense black text. Some is softer and better suited to cheap pamphlets. Watermarks, patterns wired into the papermaker's screen, identify the mill, and experienced printers develop preferences for certain marks because they indicate a sheet that will behave predictably under the press. For prestigious projects, a small number of copies may be printed on vellum, yielding volumes that radiate expense and are destined for altars, chancels, and donors' libraries. Vellum requires adjustments at the press. It is less absorbent than paper, so inking must be delicate, and pressure must be even to avoid puckering. The shop adjusts all this without fanfare. The goal is not to dazzle. The goal is to fulfill an order that will satisfy a buyer who expects certain standards and will return if those standards are met. Regulatory oversight threads through this world quietly. Universities assert control over the texts used in their lecture halls, issuing approvals and sometimes privileges to favored printers. Ecclesiastical authorities review editions of liturgical texts and doctrinal works, ensuring conformity. Civil authorities keep an eye out for libels and disruptions to public order. To you, the balance may look precarious, but in practice, it operates through routines. Licenses, permissions, and prefaces declaring authorization become part of the printed apparatus. The printer, who must anticipate scrutiny, trains his workers not only in craft but in restraint. Avoid innovations in text where none are invited. Adhere to established spellings and readings. Introduce improvements in layout that aid comprehension without stirring controversy. This is the pragmatism of a trade that earns its living by being acceptable to many different overseers at once. Within the shop, the division of labor grows more refined as the business matures. A type founder linked to the shop supplies consistent fonts. A compositor specializes in certain sizes and faces, his hands learning the weight of particular sorts. A pressman pairs with another pressman in a partnership that moves with choreographed efficiency. A corrector develops a house style and ensures its steady application. A manager watches inventory and money. Apprentices move through stations, learning discipline at each stop. Their first tasks are rarely glamorous, sweeping floors to keep dust from the ink and type, sorting sorts back into cases, practicing lines of nonsense until their hands know the map of the case without looking, fetching ink and oil, cutting strips of paper to use for make-ready. The pride of the shop is not in exotic devices, but in the steady elevation of novices into reliable workers who can be trusted with a press, a form, or a proof. Conflicts do not disappear. They become predictable. Credit is a perpetual tension. Customers ask for generous terms. Printers need cash to keep buying supplies and paying wages. Some printers extend credit with caution. Others require stronger deposits for risky clients. Disputes over quality arise as well. A buyer claims a batch is too light, margins too tight, or rubrication missing. The printer has records, proofs kept as exemplars, specifications noted in the ledger, to resolve such claims. In some cases, compromise is simple, a discount, a reprint of a problem gathering. The lesson that repeats in these lines is that the press makes books, but bookkeeping makes presses survive. It might surprise you to learn how much the aesthetics of the page result from constraints that seem purely mechanical. Justified columns where lines end in a straight right edge are not only pleasing, they also maximize the use of space and create a strong page that guides the eye. The width of a column is not only a matter of taste, it emerges from what a compositor can justify cleanly with a given type size, what a reader can track without losing the line, and what a binder can sew without awkward bulging. Leading, the space between lines, has roots in metal strips that quite literally lead the eye and prevent letters from touching in printing. Margins are not waste. They are room for hands to hold, for notes to be made, and for trimming in binding. The beautiful comes from the useful repeated until it looks inevitable. As you stand at the edge of the room, you notice the quiet presence of failures that have been tamed. A box sits on a shelf, filled with damaged type, the hell box. These sorts will be melted and recast. Several alternates of a letter lie in a small tray because a matrix wore unevenly, and those sorts drift from a font that otherwise matches perfectly. A damp winter day forces the shop to adjust drying racks because paper is slow to release moisture and risks set off. A compositor has a small nick on his finger, legacy of a hurried day when he tried to justify a line too quickly and pressed a sharp edge. Every scar and workaround becomes part of the house knowledge, the law that apprentices absorb. That law is what lets the shop dial back conjecture and dial up consistency. In the evening, you step into the front room where finished gatherings rest in neat stacks, wrapped, labeled, and ready to move. A man enters with a small list of titles, sizes, and quantities. He is a stationer representing a school several towns away. The conversation is swift and almost formulaic. He wants a certain grammar in octavo, cheap paper, plain binding. He asks whether a new edition corrected the list of irregular verbs that caused confusion in the previous printing. The printer assures him that the corrector and the teacher compared notes, and the errors are fixed. They agree on a price and a delivery date, measured not in days but by the fare at which the stationer expects to resupply. A calendar of commerce that stands alongside the church calendar and the agricultural year in shaping a city's time. What? Then of selection, what deserves type? The answer is not chiseled in stone. It is constantly negotiated. Printers listen to readers who ask for specific works. They watch competitors to see which forms sell. They talk with teachers, preachers, lawyers, and physicians who know what texts their communities use. Riskier ventures, new authors, controversial topics, are sometimes handled through partnerships that diffuse responsibility or by printing anonymously to reduce exposure. So the shop balances the flood and the filter, producing in quantity the steady sellers and choosing with care the projects that require judgment. A printer who floods indiscriminately risks slow-moving inventory and angry creditors. A printer who filters too severely risks idleness and irrelevance. Steadiness is the virtue. Steady presswork, steady cash flow, steady selection, aligned with readers' real habits. At last, someone blows out a lamp. The press is silent for a few hours. The room holds the day's warmth, the smell of oil and paper, the faint metallic trace that lingers where type has been handled. You run your hand along the press's frame and feel the smoothness worn by years of touch. The machine itself is simple, but the web around it is intricate. Contracts, privileges, fairs, roads, mills, guilds, schools, parishes. The wonder you carry is less about a single spark than about a whole city turning its skills toward a common instrument until it becomes ordinary. And as you step outside into the cool air and hear the river, you hold a question for the morning that follows. Once presses like this multiply and spread to other towns, what new channels of words will they open, and what unanticipated currents, good and difficult, will those channels begin to carry next? You begin the last movement of this story outside the press room, at a fairground that smells of damp canvas and wool. Wooden stalls line a street churned by carts, and bundles wrapped in coarse paper arrive tied with twine and sealed with wax. This is where the trade thickens. Money, promises, signatures in ledger hands. What started in a single workshop becomes a network, and the fair becomes its hinge. You see printers and stationers exchanging not only books, but also information, who's cutting a new face of Roman type, which mill's paper runs truer under pressure, which city magistrate is tightening licenses. The scene is ordinary and decisive. If the press is the heart, the fair is the artery, and the pulse that runs through it is schedule. Deliver in time for spring and autumn. Align new grammars with the start of term. Meet the demand for calendars well before the new year. Every shop learns to think in seasons as much as in sheets. The goods change shape here. Large folios lie flat in crates. Cheaper octavos and duodecimos stack neatly into tighter bundles that a horse can carry longer without breaking stride. This is where format becomes strategy. You listen to a bookseller explain why a small format travels better and sells faster to students and clerks. It slips into a satchel, costs less, and can be replaced without grief if lost. A printer who learned to think in columns and justified lines now must think in hands and pocket. The change is not heroic, it is practical. Type paper, smaller type, tighter margins. Each is calculated to offer a price point with enough legibility to satisfy readers whose eyes are younger and whose purses are thin. The virtue here is not extravagance but fit. Back in the shops, fonts become a quiet language of ambition. The early black letter that connects printed pages to the manuscripts that preceded them remains sturdy in places where liturgy and law value continuity, but an increasingly popular Roman type, cut with clarity and proportioned with a humanist's eye, promises a page that breathes. The decision to adopt a new face is a bet on the reader's taste. It draws customers who prefer a cleaner line and a lighter page, especially for classical texts and scholarship. Italic appears too, not as ornament, but as a practical compression. Its slanted, narrow form saves space, permitting smaller books without sacrificing word count. Now a printer must manage not only stocks of paper and ink, but also ranges of faces and sizes. Cases multiply. Correctors standardize the use of a face for a genre. A catalogue begins to list not only titles but also the type in which they appear. Fonts stop being invisible and become sales tools, quiet ones, but effective. The business reaches for stability in small tools of memory. Colophons and title pages accrue details that were once scattered or absent. The printer's name, the city, the year, the privileges granted, sometimes even the price or the place to purchase. You may leaf to the end of a volume and find a modest line that tells you the number of sheets, the date the last forme came off the press, and the corrector's initials. In a trade that lives on repetition, these details are like nails in a timbered roof. They let others build on what has been made, trace a book's origin when disputes arise, and monitor the performance of a shop across projects. The printer's mark, a device stamped or printed, becomes a guarantee to the market. It says, without saying much, that what you hold meets a standard. Reputation circulates in these small emblems, and reputation is credit made visible. With more presses working more hours, the city hum changes. Bookbinding grows into a craft with its own rhythms. Parchmenters and papermakers adjust production cycles to the press's appetite. Foundries refine their alloys for a sharper, longer-lasting face. Carpenters become adept at maintaining screws and frames. Trundlers and porters learn not only to carry but to wait in line at customs houses that check bundles moving across city borders. The press is not a solitary invention. It is a pattern that trains other hands. You see it in the way a mill begins to watermark paper reliably, signaling to distant buyers that this sheet will behave. You see it in the way a type founder keeps molds and matrices in good order, aware that a font's unevenness will show in the page and cost the printer time in make ready. To call this a revolution is to risk missing its texture. It is a sedimentation of competence. At the same time, the press exposes new vulnerabilities. Speed multiplies errors as well as words. A compositor who rushes introduces a transposition that the corrector misses in a late proof. A pressman, trying to keep pace, prints a gathering lightly so that faded pages mingle with good ones. A binder, paid by quantity, trims too close and binds a text that loses a hairline of type into the gutter. You might never notice these flaws if you read in a hurry. You will notice them if you live with the book for years. Shops absorb lessons and codify preventative habits. They create standard pauses for joint review before sending forms to press. They store exemplars of pages to match in tone and impression. They sample gatherings from piles to catch drift earlier. None of this produces headlines. It produces reliability slowly until readers take it for granted. As the trade's competence grows, the range of texts diversifies. Law books with marginal references and indexes map a field that once lived in memory and manuscripts. Bibles and prayer books with standardized readings bring parishes into closer textual alignment. Grammars and dictionaries train a broader population to read and write. Medical and arithmetic manuals circulate practical knowledge that townspeople can apply without access to master teachers. The press does not conjure new ideas from air. It scales the distribution of what teachers and clerks once copied by hand and makes iterative correction feasible. An error in one edition becomes a note in the next. The corrected note becomes a standard. The standard becomes a habit. Standards, if you look closely, are only corrected errors that have settled. This is also the point where speed and opinion discover each other. Pamphlets, small, cheap, fast, become a form suited to argument. The very same shop that prints a calendar one week prints a tract the next. The printer's survival depends on flexibility, but flexibility carries exposure. A text that pleases one authority irritates another. A corrective pamphlet that clarifies doctrine in one city is classed as sedition in another. So you watch the rise of strategies that are less dramatic than they are prudent. Anonymous imprints appear on sensitive items. Controversial gatherings are printed in smaller, cautious runs. Printers form alliances with patrons who can shelter them from the worst consequences of a misjudgment. The logic is not noble or cynical. It is practical. A shop cannot serve readers if it is shut. Censorship and privilege form a set of counterweights that printers learn to manage. Licenses required for religious works, approvals for university textbooks, privileges that grant exclusivity for specific titles. Each arrives with paperwork and conditions. A printer who wants to avoid trouble keeps a clean file, copies of permissions, letters from professors praising an edition's accuracy, records of deliveries to official customers. The paperwork is dull and life-saving. It gives a shop something to present in the face of a raid or a complaint, and it keeps honest misunderstandings from becoming disastrous accusations. When you read a calm line on a title page asserting official approval, you read not ceremony but insurance. On the production floor, economies of repetition become quieter than ever. Jobbing work, forms, handbills, notices, legal blanks, flows between larger projects, keeping the press from idling. A form is seldom unlocked prematurely if another sheet can be imposed to use the setup. Printers develop a sense of the half-hour wasted here, the quarter-hour saved there. They keep duplicate sets of common sorts to avoid bottlenecks in distribution. They train a compositor to pick in the dark, if necessary, hands faster than eyes. They keep a small stock of ornaments and borders to dress a page quickly when a customer wants a dignified look without the cost of engraving. This is the opposite of glamour. It is the thickening of a craft into procedure. Meanwhile, cities begin to look different in a way that is too incremental to notice day by day. Stationers' shops sprout larger windows to display bound volumes. Scholars' rooms acquire walls of uniform spines. Schools issue lists of required texts that parents can find beyond the local scribe. A town's notary office reduces the time to produce a document because printed blanks await names, dates, and sums. Post riders carry letters faster because standardized printed schedules tell them where to be and when. Accountants reconcile debts more cleanly because printed numeration tables replace error-prone scribbles. If you look only at the press, you miss this. You must look at the ambient order that firm pages support. You may also be tempted to see only winners, but printing survives because it tolerates middling outcomes and learns from them. Some shops fold. They misjudge demand, mismanage credit, or offend authorities. Their tools and type are absorbed by rivals or partners, and the city's press count dips before it rises again. Workers drift to more stable shops. Skills consolidate. You could call this creative destruction, but to the apprentice looking for wages, it is only a difficult month. The trade's resilience lies not in permanent success for each player, but in the persistence of the form, type, ink, paper, press, schedule. Once enough people know how to keep that form alive, no single failure can extinguish it. There is a quieter change in pages themselves. Tables become more common, indexes more systematic. Page numbers settle into places where fingers can find them. Running heads stabilize. Signatures become less cryptic. Compositors and correctors, in consultation with learned customers, figure out what helps readers return to places quickly. The index, a tool of memory, becomes a bridge between the reader's needs and the page's structure. No one celebrates such changes with fireworks. They become ordinary, and in becoming ordinary, they alter what readers expect from a book. Expectations are invisible scaffolds. They support everything that comes later. The craft also touches sound. Music, which once relied on painstaking notation by hand, learns to share the page with type through techniques that combine movable notes with staff lines or employ engraved plates. Printers wrestle with the alignment problem, how to keep notes sitting cleanly on staffs across impressions, and invent solutions that are workable, if not perfect. The result is not a flood of virtuosity, but a steadier supply of liturgical and instructional music. Parish choirs learn from the same layouts. Teachers hand out uniform exercises. The ear benefits from the eye's new reliability. As the 16th century advances, the press becomes a river that new currents enter. Controversies in doctrine and governance find the press an eager medium. Reformers and their critics adopt formats that fit urgency: broadsides, pamphlets, short treatises. The printer's calculus shifts again. Short runs increase in number. Inventory turns faster. Risk rises. A shop that survives this period is not necessarily the boldest. It is the one that balances bread and butter work with controlled forays into hot topics, keeps paperwork in order, maintains relationships with patrons and officials, and guards its workers from recklessness. The romantic image of a printer as a partisan warrior has its episodes, but the daily truth is tactical patience. Travel outward, and you see how the craft adapts to languages and markets. In one region, printers keep to dense black letter for familiarity. In another, they adopt graceful Romans and italics to signal a humanist turn. In another, bilingual pages appear, bridging communities with different tongues. Type founders learn new alphabets and diacritics. Compositors adjust to different rhythms of spacing. Correctors born to one language become competent in a second. The map of printing is not monochrome. It is a quilt of local comfort stitched together by the shared mechanics of the press. At the individual level, reading changes in ways that the press encourages without dictating. Private ownership rises. Marginal notes accumulate. Commonplace books fill with excerpts copied from identical pages that friends own, so that shared page numbers ease conversation. A teacher can refer to a specific line and trust that students will find it in their copies. Households build small shelves. A traveler tucks an octavo into a cloak. None of this is dramatic. It is incremental. But increment piled upon increment raises a floor. When you circle back to the workshop where this European story began, the press looks the same, and that sameness is the point. It sits unmoved while everything around it learns to orbit with greater precision. The screw still turns. The plait end still descends. The ink still skins if left uncovered. Paper still swells on a rainy day. The people have changed. They carry more precedent in their heads, precedents for how to lay out a page, how to bargain for a privilege, how to recover from a spill that mixes fonts, how to calculate a print run that won't drown capital in slow-moving stock. They have more companions in other cities to send letters to about paper prices and to ask for matrices when a face wears down. The city as a whole is better at this, not because it worships novelty, but because it repeats the right things and discards the wrong ones. And if you insist on a climax, it is not a shout, but a saturation. There are simply more pages, more uniform, more accessible, more quickly available than any previous generation has known. With that abundance comes a settling of expectations, that a law will be printed in a form one can consult, that a prayer book will match the pattern used elsewhere, that a student text will be available for a new term, that a controversy will generate pamphlets on both sides, that a traveller can find a guide, that a merchant can trust a manual's tables, that a reader can acquire a book, not as a rare possession, but as an affordable tool. Abundance is a shock only once. Then it becomes a background, and the background changes what can be built. You leave the press room in evening light and consider the lesson that lies quietly at your feet. A tool that forces precision trains more than hands. It trains institutions and habits. Order grows from pressure, and pressure, when well managed, produces clarity. The next world you will enter, where guilds and censors, editors and readers meet in the long corridors of early modern power, will preserve this order while bending it to new ends. It will be less about the invention itself and more about how people learn to live with abundance without losing their grip on accuracy. So you carry one question forward as a ballast rather than a burden. Once the page became ordinary, who came to control it? Who learned to bend it? And how did readers, in their quiet thousands, make that control both possible and limited all at once? Ink, guilds, and quiet power. You walk into an office that does not smell of ink. It smells of paper here too, but dry and cool, and of sealing wax and leather. It is not a press room, it is a registry. A clerk sits with a ledger open, entering the details of a petition for a license to print a new edition of a textbook. This is the other half of the world the press created, the half that manages words as things that must be counted, permitted, and sometimes stopped. The clerk's motions are as meticulous as any compositor's. He writes in measured script, copies the title exactly, notes the printer's name, the city, the proposed format, and, crucially, the license is already attached from ecclesiastical or academic authorities. Approval is not a single stamp, it is a sequence, and each stamp fits the rhythms of a different institution's calendar. You sense immediately that the relationship between printers and authorities is not simply adversarial or obedient, it is procedural. Printers need licenses to shield themselves from later accusations. Authorities need printers to enact policies and disseminate approved texts. A printer who understands this speaks the language of compliance fluently. He attaches prefaces declaring conformity. He cites privileges that protect his investment. He submits proofs of corrections in sensitive works. He prints errata sheets where authorized editors require them. The printer's office becomes bilingual in law and craft. Contracts with authors and booksellers share space in drawers with letters of privilege and licenses. When inspectors visit, a well-run shop produces paperwork with the same neatness it produces pages. Walk back into the press room and watch how this bureaucracy shapes the ordinary. A form is locked for a catechism only after the corrector compares it line by line with an approved version. A proof is sent to a theological reviewer who marks variants. The shop adjusts and resubmits. Deadlines stretch. The press prints jobbing work while waiting, then returns to the catechism when permission arrives. No one declares a drama. They manage a schedule. You begin to see that the early modern page is a braided cord, craft, commerce, and control. Remove one strand and the others fray. Keep them in tension and the cord holds. Guilds and associations offer printers a local structure that is as protective as it is constraining. Membership requires dues, adherence to standards, and sometimes compliance with labor regulations that fix wages and apprenticeship terms. In return, members receive protection against unfair competition and a forum to resolve disputes. A guild records who has the right to operate a press within city walls, who may sell books, who may bind them, and how many apprentices a master may train. The rules look fussy, and they are. They also stabilize a volatile trade. In a market where a single bad edition can ruin a shop's name, collective enforcement of quality standards prevents a race to the bottom. The quiet truth is that printers willingly submit to oversight, when oversight protects the floor they stand on. Readers appear in this world as more than buyers. They are participants with their own habits of approval and disapproval. A teacher refuses to adopt a grammar with sloppy errata. A preacher prefers a psalter with clear rubrics and generous margins. A merchant writes to a printer asking for a new edition of an arithmetic manual with tables suited to local measures. A physician warns a printer that a widely used medical handbook requires a correction in a dosage that could harm patients. Readers' letters are not blazes of fame. They are nudges that align commerce with utility. Printers who heed them prosper quietly. Those who ignore them learn through unsold bundles. What about control that fears dissent more than error? You observe the mechanics without rhetoric. Inspectors visit shops with lists of prohibited works and instructions to seize copies and blocks or type if necessary. Printers, aware of the risk, develop risk maps. Which titles draw scrutiny? Which clients can be trusted not to demand sudden shifts in content? Which towns are safer to ship to with controversial pamphlets? Some shops split their identities, one imprint for safe work, another shadow imprint for risky ventures. Others refuse certain jobs outright. None of this is dramatic when viewed day by day. It is a series of small decisions whose sum keeps a shop's door open. A printer's calculation is not only moral or political, it is existential. Feed your workers, keep your press oiled, and live to print another day. When you reduce the story to these dull edges, you see readers' resilience more clearly. They learn to read between lines. Marginalia become dialogues in low light, students copying glosses from a teacher's exemplar, pastors annotating sermons with references, lawyers noting cases and page numbers along the edge. Ownership inscriptions travel through time, telling you which town held which book and who paid for it. Book plates assert dignity. Bindings signal thrift or wealth. In the absence of links and networks as you know them, these marks are the threads by which texts move through social space. A list of borrowed titles in a rector's notebook speaks volumes about a parish's concerns. A trail of repairs, sewn gatherings, patched corners, shows a book's life in hands that could not spare money but would not spare care. The supply chain hardens into custom. Paper arrives on a schedule synchronized with a mill's ability to dry sheets in certain months. Leather for bindings is salted against warm weather. Wood for press repairs is seasoned long in advance. Type metal is reclaimed methodically from damaged sorts into ingots. That last practice deserves your attention. In a trade where capital hides in small pieces of lead, the hellbox, the bin where broken and worn sorts go to die, is a bank. Melted, cleaned, and recast, those sorts return as new letters. Nothing that can be repaired is wasted. You can feel the ethic here. Thrift without miserliness, maintenance without mania. It is resilience practiced daily. There are, too, these slow channels of distribution that carry books beyond cities. Peddlers and chapmen carry cheap prints and pamphlets, ballads and chapbooks to doorsteps far from shops. Parish priests receive parcels of approved devotional material. Schoolmasters, bundles of elementary readers. Midwives, practical pamphlets that are read until they disintegrate. These lowly vehicles are the invisible capillaries of the printed body. They do not carry prestige. They carry familiarity. When a town far from any press turns to a calendar with confidence, it is because someone returned year after year with the same format and the same dependability. Inside the shop, readers' preferences alter page structure. You find cookbooks with wider margins where users can add substitutions and notes, travel guides with generous line spacing for legibility in poor light, law books with line numbers to facilitate exact citation. Choices like these are not decrees. They are accommodations that become standards. A printer who notices such things captures a market. The press, for all its severity, is hospitable to formats that reinforce readers' routines. If a preacher's eye tracks a certain way, a printer will design to ease that motion. The best shops learn to be invisible in this way. The page feels natural because it has been engineered to match habit. Education systematizes this cooperation. Universities and schools create lists of approved texts, sometimes granting exclusive contracts to printers who can promise timely delivery and accurate editions. Correctors in those shops become adjuncts to pedagogy, maintaining a cycle of small improvements, spelling regularized here, a paragraphing scheme improved there, a table relaid for easier use. The reward is steady work and a durable relationship that can weather political shifts. A printer who becomes a school's preferred supplier is like a baker with a monastery's account, not glamorous, but secure. The policing of texts intensifies and then relaxes depending on the decade and the city. You will find periods with public burnings and confiscations, and periods with a more tolerant drift where oversight emphasizes doctrinal clarity rather than punitive spectacle. Shops adapt. In tighter regimes, they lean on uncontroversial work, almanacs, calendars, devotional aids, schoolbooks, and slow their output of opinion. In looser regimes, they print more aggressively, knowing that fines are more likely than closures. The baseline remains: survive, keep your crew intact, and keep machinery in good repair so you can respond when opportunity returns. The press rewards patience more often than bravado. As you survey this world, you also register the quiet power of imprints. To print in a certain city under a certain name in a certain year is to locate a text in a political and commercial landscape. Imprints broadcast trust or a warning. A city known for clean paper and precise type commands an invisible premium. A printer known for dirty impression and slovenly corrections struggles to persuade buyers even with low prices. Without advertisements as you understand them, a shop invests in reliability as its marketing. The ledger reflects it. Fewer returns, faster payment cycles, more repeat buyers. Reputation here is measurable. Step into a bindery and consider how censorship and commerce pass through it as well. A binder may be instructed to remove a gathering or to tip in a replacement leaf, turning each copy into a slightly different witness to control. Book historians later will track these variants, but in the moment the act is banal: a knife, a paste brush, a press to hold the block while the binder works. If you want a symbol of the era's management of print, it is this: quiet excisions and insertions done with professional calm, changing a page's meaning by a hair and leaving the rest intact. The medium does not fight. It accepts modification and carries on. You end this first section where you began, with a clerk at a desk. He is checking a bond posted by a printer to guarantee that a particular edition will conform to an approved text. The clerk's face gives nothing away. He is neither against nor for anything. He is a hinge through which the trade moves. Printers know his schedule, his preferences, his insistence on complete signatures. He knows which shops deserve trust and which require closer inspection. Without such people, the press would generate conflict faster than a city could absorb it. With them, the energy of the press is channeled. The channel is neither narrow nor wide. It is proportioned to keep craft, commerce, and control in flow. And as the clerk sands the ink on his entry and closes the ledger, you might ask yourself what happens when readers find ways of creating their own channels, private libraries, reading circles, and correspondence networks that move words beyond ledgers and licenses while still depending on the same presses. To make the words solid in the first place, if you stand in the middle distance between a press and a registry, you begin to see the routes that words must take before they arrive in hands. The path is not just ink to page. It is a trail of permissions, stamps, signatures, and discreet conversations that keep the path open. You follow a printer's runner down a street you have walked before, and notice what you didn't see. The stop at a notary to witness a contract. The pause at a bookseller's door to confirm a standing order. The climb to a scholar's attic for a last-minute correction on a proof. At each stop, someone leaves a mark in a book that is not the book being made, a ledger entry, a receipt, a marginal note on a loose sheet that will be filed and eventually forgotten. These paper traces are the scaffolding that lets the printed text stand upright. You understand, perhaps for the first time, that a shop's discipline of attention is not only about type and ink, but about promises that must be kept on paper that no reader ever sees. The discipline shows in the way a shop handles quiet risk. A censor has not answered a query about a passage in a devotional. The forme is locked and waiting. The press cannot sit idle, so jobbing work fills the gap. Already printed sheets hang to dry, into leave to prevent offsetting. Once dry, they are folded into gatherings collated by hand, the signatures checked against a sample. Somewhere, a binder is repairing a press that has loosened under steady pressure. Another worker scrapes a burr from a capital that printed faintly grey all morning. The rhythm is steady because the stakes are. Any slip can cascade. A lost sheet means a reprint of a gathering. A late delivery means a missed fare. A missed fare means a slow season for the shop and lost wages for workers who cannot afford a gap. In that frame, restraint looks less like caution and more like the simple arithmetic of survival. You might want drama, but the craft offers you repetition that hardens into security. Look at the way a compositor's eye moves. He reads forward, sets the present line, and constantly glances backward to understand the line's ending, measuring by instinct how much space is left in the stick. Whether a hyphenation makes sense at the margin, whether a line's white will create a distracting river if he justifies too loosely. This is a conversation between hand and eye that leaves no trace in the text beyond the text's ease of reading. The better the work, the less you notice the work. This invisibility is its own kind of power. It persuades readers that order is natural. Once a generation has read from pages that hold their shape across volumes and cities, deviations begin to look like faults rather than charming variations. An ordinary expectation becomes a quiet law. That law is enforced by neither police nor priests alone. It is enforced by guild custom, by the habits of buyers, by the shop's own fear of waste. The guild, with its rules on apprenticeship, materials, and fair dealing, might feel restrictive to you, but you watch what happens when rules slip. Cheap, poorly sized paper bleeds ink and yields muddy letters. Shoddy type wears quickly and begins to pit, leaving a snow of dots where none should be. Presses without proper packing crush type and bruise letters into a smear. The resulting books do not sell well. They return as damaged goods. A guild that insists on minimum standards protects the floor under everyone's feet. Whatever you think about gatekeeping in theory, in practice it is a way to keep the trade from eating itself. Of course, pressure never flows in only one direction. Readers push in their own way. A schoolmaster complains that a popular grammar's index has grown useless as new editions shift entries. A shop responds by standardizing running heads and page numbers across reprints. A preacher asks for thicker paper for a sermon book because thin sheets turn transparent in candlelight and confuse the eye. The next edition uses a heavier stock. A surgeon writes that a dosage table must be relaid to avoid ambiguity in a column. The printer's corrector works through the night to recast the grid with clearer spacing and marks. If you look for heroics, you will not see them. If you look for care, you will see it everywhere. The printed world is dense with small courtesies to readers that become, over time, the architecture of trust. Still, some texts will not pass with a stamp. Opinions sharpen into pamphlets. Policy disputes ooze into treatises. Local grievances flow into broadsides. The shop that wishes to live long has strategies. It may print controversial matter out of sequence at odd hours using spare fonts and older paper so that a normal day's work leaves no obvious gap. It may divide labor, assigning sensitive composition to a single trusted compositor and press work to a pair who can be relied upon not to talk. It may borrow a rival's press after hours in exchange for a fee and a promise of reciprocal favors. It may ship gatherings unbound to a distant town where covers will be added, imprint chosen, and sales conducted away from prying eyes. The ingenuity is not bold but methodical. It is a set of adjustments measured against the likely cost of being discovered. If you wonder how such maneuvers remain plausible, consider the volume of the ordinary that moves alongside them. A city's presses fill their calendars with almanacs, song sheets, account books, school texts, legal forms, devotional manuals, and calendars. These are the river within which eddies form. Inspectors who enter a shop see stacks of approved matter. They look for the telltale signs of haste or secrecy. The scattered sorts on the floor, the newly scoured type where a former was hurriedly broken, the faint smell of fresh ink where no job is scheduled. A prudent master keeps the visible room calm. Even when printing nothing delicate, he teaches his workers to tidy as they go and to keep a single rhythm rather than a stop-start frenzy that draws unnecessary attention. The circulation system beyond the door has its own forms of prudence. Booksellers prefer to order cautiously rather than speculate wildly. Schools place standing orders for modest numbers. Parishes ask for predictable quantities of prayer books and psalters. Merchants buy account books as needed. The press learns to love the steady. The occasional windfall, a best-selling pamphlet, a popular collection of stories, cannot be relied upon. You begin to see why printers become conservative in selection, even when they are technically bold. They build on a base that pays rent and wages, and they use the margin to experiment. The experiments that harm no one but the printer are the easiest. A new typeface, a different format, a revised index. The experiments that might attract attention are rationed carefully. You might ask what role the author plays in all this. Often the author is present as a corrector, a provider of copy, a correspondent who begs for haste and rails at delay. In other cases, the author is a committee, a university faculty approving a text, a chapter, drafting a catechism, a council standardizing Psalter responses. The printer's relation to authorship is practical rather than romantic. He needs clear copy, timely responses, and settled decisions. A manuscript that changes in the middle of imposition wastes paper and time. The printer therefore cultivates authors who know the rhythms of production. Authors who do not learn those rhythms are less likely to be returned to, not because their ideas are unworthy, but because their processes spill costs onto a shop that cannot absorb them indefinitely. The shop also becomes, by necessity, a small school in attention. Apprentices are taught not only where letters lie in the case, but how to read for predictable errors, doubled lines, skipped lines, transposed minims, misread contractions. They are taught to pace themselves. A tired compositor is a dangerous one. They are taught to care for their tools, to notice the feel of a type's face under a fingertip, to hear the slightly duller thud of a letter packing down where a shimming strip is too thick, to sense when ink has thickened and must be refreshed to prevent pebbled impressions. This training is as much about temperament as skill. The best workers are not those who burn brightly, but those who glow steadily. In quieter ways, power asserts itself through cataloguing. Title pages grow more informative. Imprints become uniform. A printer's device becomes recognizable across towns. These are not mere ornaments. They allow the market to function. A stationer in a distant place can order with confidence when names, dates, and formats are predictable. A reader who prefers a printer's work can look for a sign and find it. The same holds for disfavor. A shop that repeatedly sends out dirty prints or sloppy corrections finds itself avoided, privileges notwithstanding. Presentation and performance are twins here. One cannot compensate for the other indefinitely. You notice, too, how the physical city adapts to hold this apparatus. Streets near the press districts take on the smell of oil and paper. Alleys are lined with racks for drying sheets. Warehouses store bundles awaiting transport. Inns make space in their stables for crates that must be guarded overnight. River ports grow accustomed to bales marked with symbols that identify a mill, a printer, a destination. Timetables appear on walls. The day a packet leaves, the day a fair begins, the day an examination term starts. In a city where bells once set the rhythm for worship and work alone, printed schedules make a second rhythm audible. Time becomes more finely divided not because of a decree, but because the press rewards punctuality. Even beyond cities, the press's habits drip steadily into everyday life. Rural chapmen develop routes that take account of markets and feasts. They measure loads by what a horse can carry without tiring and by which roads rut least in bad weather. They learn which villages will buy ballads and which prefer catechisms, which schoolmasters are strict and therefore require uniform books, which parsons pay for pamphlets and which prefer to borrow. They carry news of what readers like and dislike, bring back requests for formats that suit a community's eyes and habits, and pass along careful gossip about what inspectors are looking for this season. The network looks informal, but it is a lattice that strengthens with use. All the while, the correction of texts across editions becomes a culture in itself. Errata slips, small lists of errors and corrections, are printed and tipped into volumes. Later editions fold those corrections into the body and correct the errata of errata. It is slow and you might be tempted to mock the fussiness. But scale the method across thousands of books and decades, and you witness an accumulation of accuracy that hand copying alone rarely produce so uniformly. In that sense, censorship and correction inhabit adjacent rooms. One seeks to constrain meaning, the other seeks to clarify it. The press accommodates both, not out of ideology, but because both arrive as instructions attached to jobs the press needs to complete. Sometimes the system breaks. A warehouse fire destroys stacks of folded sheets. A flood ruins a cellar where blocks were stored. A rider is robbed and his packets disappear. A city's politics turns, and licenses are revoked without notice. The response, again, is not heroic. The shop draws on reserves, leans on friends, borrows a rival's press at night, sends a trusted worker to a mill to secure paper on credit, writes a careful petition to a magistrate asking for reconsideration. The discipline of attention turns into the discipline of endurance. Many small firms fail. Others absorb them. In the long view, the survivor's advantage rests less on audacity than on the management of dull constraints. Predict cash flow, pace jobs, maintain tools, preserve relationships, and avoid unnecessary fights. When you gather these strands together, guild rules, licenses, reader feedback, Chapman's roots, errata culture, risk maps, imprints, you begin to appreciate why the printed page feels inevitable. It is not inevitable. It is maintained. And in that maintenance lies a distrust of spectacle. The people who keep the system going do not imagine themselves as revolutionaries. They are custodians of smoothness. If a page reads easily, it is because hundreds of careful acts arrange themselves in a sequence that you were never asked to admire. If a text remains consistent from town to town, it is because the incentives of a trade and the habits of a public pulled in the same direction. That quiet convergence is a power worth noticing. As evening leans in and the last forms of jobbing work are unlocked, you hold one question that takes shape almost without your consent. If all this power rests on habits that readers barely notice, on imprints, signatures, schedules, and 1,000 small adjustments, what happens when readers begin to organize themselves, to compare editions deliberately, to form circles where texts are shared and debated, to build private libraries that become public ones in slow motion? In other words, when the reader's hand grows confident and collective, how far does the old balance of printer, censor, and guild still reach? And where does it begin to slip? You step through a door that is not a shop and not a church and not a registry. It is a room dense with talk and steam where cups clink and papers rustle. The table before you holds a mixture of things that could not have existed in such easy company a century earlier. Gazettes with regular headings, pamphlets in small formats, broadsides pinned to a wall, a bound volume of essays that everyone seems to have heard of, and a catalogue from a bookseller who has thoughtfully arranged titles by subject and size. This is the space where the printed page finds its voice, not by speaking aloud, but by being read side by side until patterns form in the mind. The room is not elevated in tone. People argue, agree, revise, copy lines into notebooks. The discipline of attention, trained by the press, now leaves the shop and enters the public's head. You can follow the trail backward. Regularized schedules of printing allow news to be gathered at intervals that readers come to expect. Presses develop routines for small, quick runs. Riders carry bundles of sheets along routes already used for letters and ledgers. A gazette needs not only paper and ink, but a calendar. The press provides the calendar. It also provides the formats that make reading in public manageable. Columns narrow enough for the eye, type large enough to read in mixed light, headings that guide the skimming reader to what he wants. These are small mercies, and they enable new habits. The folding of a paper along a seam, the flattening of it on a table, the argument that points to a paragraph and draws another into the line with a finger. Reading, which used to be solitary and slow, acquires public settings that do not destroy its quiet. They surround it with murmurs. Catalogues grow thicker and adopt a language that helps readers navigate abundance. Titles sorted by subject, by author, by format. Prices listed openly. Locations noted. Privileges declared. New editions announced. The catalogue is a map of the printed city. To move through it successfully is to triangulate taste, necessity, and means. A merchant has one set of coordinates, manuals, tables, legal forms. A student another, grammars, glosses, commonplaces. A parish priest a third, sermons, catechisms, music. The printer and bookseller read the same maps to plan stock. When readers visit a shop and ask for a title by name, a new relationship forms. The buyer is not seeking a copy. The buyer seeks a particular copy in a particular dress. This degree of choice is modest measured against your era, but measured against an earlier one, it is immense. Libraries, first private, then civic, make those choices sticky. A household sets a shelf in a corner and begins to fill it with books that will not be sold but kept. The decision alters the book's destiny. Margins fill with notes that won't be scraped away because there is no plan to sell. Bindings are chosen for durability rather than display. Indexes are used with the confidence that page numbers will be waited for rather than guessed at. The library slowly changes a reader's approach to time. A book can be returned to tomorrow, next year, in the next generation. The press's habit of consistency across editions amplifies this possibility. A son can open a book and find his father's notes still pinned to the same page because the pagination holds steady. Consistency becomes continuity. Alongside these domestic shelves, an economy of borrowing grows. Clubs share subscriptions to periodicals. Friends swap volumes in rotation. Parishes keep cupboards with standard texts that can be fetched when needed. Lists of loans and returns spring up, and with them, polite rules. Don't write too much in another's book. Return on time. Repair what you have damaged. Do not hoard. None of this is decreed from above. It knits together from below, supported by the press's steady ability to produce copies that resemble one another closely enough to coordinate a conversation. If every copy were idiosyncratic, shared reading would be an exercise in translation. Because copies align, shared reading becomes an exercise in thought. Control persists, of course, but it has to adapt. Bans on titles push readers to seek copies across borders. Licenses attached to cities become less relevant when bundles travel with travelers. Seizures that hit one shop drive customers to another. Authorities respond with new tools, indexes of forbidden titles, inspections at fairs, obligations on booksellers to keep lists of stock. These measures bite, but there is a counterweight growing in the room you stand in, a social expectation that printed matter belongs to ordinary life. Once the press has furnished enough calendars, primers, manuals, and prayer books, a general defense of print becomes harder to ignore. Views differ about what should be printed. Fewer people doubt that much should be. You might expect that the social spaces of reading would support only formal ideas. They support gossip, track prices, carry rumors of war, and transmit practical instructions just as often. A traveler copies a route from a printed itinerary into a journal. A mother transcribes a recipe from a household manual into her own book. A clerk learns the form of a contract by reading printed legal blanks. A musician practices from a cheap song sheet and wears it thin. The cheap, the small, the unpretentious live in these rooms with the grand. Abundance flattens some hierarchies, not by destroying status, but by making more lives legible on paper. When someone reads a cheap pamphlet with as much attention as someone else reads a learned treatise, they share a discipline even if they do not share a subject. All this pushes printers to refine their own quiet arts. Indexing becomes cleaner. Tables align more predictably. Running heads settle into standard places. Titles become less baroque and more informative. Errata shrink. Prefaces clarify purpose without florid flourishes. Formats for essays and letters adopt familiar structures that assist skimming and retrieval. The reader's time is treated as a resource with its own dignity. Wherever that dignity is honored, buyers return. It is not sentiment that enforces this respect. It is the accumulation of small competitive advantages that, when added together, become a reputation. Censorship does not vanish in the face of these shifts. It reframes itself. Sometimes it retreats into licensing only for the most public and doctrinally sensitive texts. Sometimes it concentrates on disrupting distribution rather than production. Sometimes it seeks to capture the value of print by co-opting it, commissioning official editions and flooding markets with them. Printers navigated earlier regimes by conformity and patience. They navigate these by diversification and agility. A shop that can switch from school books to jobbing work to periodicals to devotional manuals can ride the crest of most regulatory waves and wait out the breakers. You see an adjacent craft gaining influence. The editor, neither the author nor the printer alone, the editor emerges as a steward of texts, harmonizing variants across editions, correcting errors through comparison, and adding apparatus, notes, commentaries, cross-references that make reading more efficient. The editor thrives in abundance because abundance generates the need to choose and reconcile. The press made it easy to produce multiple versions. The editor makes it easier to understand which one to trust and why. In this way, the printed world learns to clean up after itself. The corrective mechanism that began with errata inside shops expands into a culture of critical reading outside them. The book trade follows suit and grows organizational muscles it previously lacked. Associations of booksellers coordinate across cities. Lists of wants and offers circulate. Credit systems stretch the time between order and payment. Insurance becomes a line in the ledger to protect shipments against storm and theft. The trade's attention to process looks dull until you consider what it prevents: accusations of cheating, collapsed deliveries, unpayable debts, and broken partnerships. Stability here is not the absence of failure. It is the management of failure so that it does not infect the entire network. Between these points, a new skill develops in readers: the ability to hold two truths in mind at once. There is the official page that carries a license and resembles 100 others issued the same year. And there is the private page that carries a friend's notes or a club's discussion. Both matter. The official page lends the certainty that allows new readers to trust what they see. The private page lends the warmth that allows reading to become part of identity. You imagine a student marking a margin, a trader underlining a table, a minister drawing a symbol next to a passage he will return to in a sermon. The press, intended by some to impose uniformity, ends up furnishing the materials by which lives diverge with richer precision. In the background, printers hold to their creed because they have learned it is safer than any scheme. Keep the press moving with decent work. Do better where you can. Do not go looking for fights you cannot win. Tend your tools. Pay your people. File your permissions. Answer your readers. The drama, when it arrives in other registers, arguments printed and reprinted, movements that use cheap formats to build recognition, authorities learning to measure their responses because clumsy attempts to suppress now often generate more copies and more interest. The press taught writers to speak to thousands. The readers taught each other to listen selectively. You end this story with a reflection not in the key of triumph, but in the key of patience. By binding craft to rules, by aligning commerce with routine, by letting control grow procedural rather than purely punitive, early modern society built a printed world that could survive shock. It absorbed new genres. It learned new fonts. It digested controversies. It kept buying almanacs and primers and manuals no matter who fought with whom. The continuity is not dullness, it is strength. And if you want to link this past to your present, you can do it by feel rather than by argument. Consider how much of your own day rests on pages you barely notice. Schedules, forms, instructions, notes, labels, short bursts of information that you consult and forget. Consider how rarely you praise them and how fiercely you would miss them if they vanished. The lesson is as quiet as a compositor's breath. The power of the printed world lies less in its capacity to shock than in its capacity to keep attention disciplined without feeling coerced. When you step out of the coffee house into a street lined with shops and presses, you carry one last question into the next chapter. If the past teaches that abundance, managed with care, breeds stability and confidence, what happens when machines accelerate that abundance far beyond handwork? When iron replaces wood, when cylinders turn under steam, when papers no longer arrive in sheets but in continuous rolls, and when the speed of printing begins to set the speed of news, markets and politics rather than merely serving them. You begin in a room that feels familiar in outline but not in weight. The frame is iron now, not wood. The bed glides more smoothly. The screw still descends, but everything around it is tighter, stronger, more forgiving under pressure. A hand press of iron, carefully machined, offers a subtle gift to the pressman: consistency with less strain. Pulls are smoother, impressions more even. Typefaces are less battered by uneven force. On a table nearby, plates sit that look like pages but are not assembled from individual sorts. They are whole surfaces bearing text. You learn the word for them, stereotypes, and you begin to understand the logic that produced them. If a form is set that you will print again and again, cast a plate from it and spare your type from long imprisonment. The stereotype stores text as a single body. The type returns to cases and serves other work. The economy is plain. Capital moves faster when it is not trapped in one job. Around the room, other changes announce themselves with quiet insistence. Ink is made in larger batches, tested for consistency. Rollers covered with composition material replace padded balls, spreading ink more evenly across a form. Paper arrives in reams from mills that use machinery to beat pulp and screens that produce more uniform sheets. Watermarks still speak for mills, but the sheets look more alike than they used to, and they behave predictably under pressure. A pressman adjusts packing with thinner layers. A compositor crafts lines knowing that impression will be truer. A corrector expects fewer light corners and can turn his attention to letters. These are evolutions, not breaks, yet every small improvement compounds. You turn then to a larger machine down the hall that hums in a way you have not heard before. It is powered by force that does not come from a man's arm. Cylinders rotate, sheets fly. A feeder guides paper into the bite of the press, and the pace, once measured in hundreds of impressions per day, climbs toward thousands. Steam, harnessed to pumps, then to engines, enters the press room and rearranges time. A single sheet can be printed on one side and then the other with speed that makes your head tilt. Noise replaces the old creak. Schedules shift. Night becomes a working day because there is now reason to race the sun. If the hand press taught discipline, the cylinder press teaches urgency. With urgency comes a new kind of text. Newspapers, which existed before, adopt the new machines as if they were waiting for them. The press sets their cadence. Night composition, from late arriving letters and reports. Early morning impressions. Distribution at dawn through streets that now expect a tide of paper at a regular hour. The newspaper is not only a collection of items, it is a clock. It sets the time for breakfast conversations, for market openings, for the first exchange of opinion among strangers. You glimpse the printed page exerting not just influence but pace, and you sense how deeply this will run. The stream that feeds the machine must grow wider. Reporters send copy faster. Editors manage flow with sharper cuts. Typesetters work in teams to handle columns at speed. Proofreaders triage errors to catch those that distort meaning and forgive those that only grate. Stereotypes let long-standing ads and recurring elements remain ready while columns swap in and out. The paper stock shifts lighter for daily sheets to keep costs down and speed drying. Ink formulations are tuned for rapid handling so that stacked papers do not smear. The city's logistics tighten. Newsboys and hawkers plan routes. Rail connections carry bundles to outlying towns. Contracts with cafes and hotels ensure piles at doors by a certain hour. It is the old lattice, strengthened and sped up. Even as steam drives cylinders, the craft retains habits of caution. Safety becomes a discipline. The moving parts demand attention. The pace punishes inattention. Guards are fitted over gears. Procedures are posted. Apprentices are trained to keep hair, sleeves, and curiosity away from hungry machines. The cost of neglect is higher than a bruised letter. It is a crushed hand. In this environment, the old temperamental virtues, steadiness, patience, tidiness, do not become obsolete. They become a shield for bodies as well as pages. The impact on selection is obvious and subtle at once. Cheap daily papers require copy, and copy attracts writers who learn to aim their voices at columns that expire quickly but leave traces in memory. Serialized novels find a home here. Readers follow them week to week, forming habits that draw them to the next issue. Legal notices, shipping lists, advertisements all pay rent for the enterprise, and their regularity turns a press from a studio into a factory. But the factory is also a school. People who never owned a bound volume now read daily, if only a column or two. The appetite for sustained reading grows with the habit of glancing. What of books in this iron age? They too change. Editions run larger, prices drop, cloth bindings replace boards and leather for many volumes, formats standardize to exploit economies of scale. Stereotypes enable reprints without retypesetting. Popular authors become staples. Publishers invest in series that promise a reliable audience. The word publisher slides from a description of a printer who issues a work to a role that coordinates selection, financing, production, and distribution across multiple shops and cities. You see the trade stratify. Some firms specialize in newspapers, others in novels, others in scientific and technical manuals, others in school books, others continue jobbing. The network becomes harder to map because its nodes multiply. Under the iron frame, censorship shifts again. Authorities learn that suppressing a daily is different from suppressing a devotional manual. The former requires interventions at pace, seizures in the night, injunctions during the day, fines swiftly levied. The latter moves in long arcs. The press, for its part, learns legal strategy. Editors develop a feel for the line between permissible and punishable. Printers keep lawyers on retainer. Publishers lobby for clearer rules. Readers learn to interpret omissions and euphemisms. Even when the legal net tightens, volume and speed complicate control. You can seize a bundle. You cannot seize a habit that has sprouted in thousands of homes. Meanwhile, the raw materials that make all this possible change in ways that alter more than cost. Paper, once rag-based, gradually incorporates wood pulp. Bleaching and sizing improve. The Fourdrinier machine, which you may hear mentioned in passing, allows continuous rolls of paper to be produced and cut, making cylinders even more efficient. Ink manufacturers scale up. Type founders refine alloys for durability at speed. Stereotype foundries perfect molds. The chain expands and tightens, and in each workshop along it, the same old virtues apply in new contexts: accuracy, consistency, maintenance, and a practical skepticism toward novelty that hasn't earned its keep. With speed comes a new vulnerability. Error can propagate more quickly. Reputational damage can ripple farther. Corrections are printed in the next issue. Apologies are crafted to be both contrite and brief. Policies are posted in offices for what to do when a mistake has already taken flight. The public develops a taste for the dance: outrage one day, revision the next, then forgetfulness as the cycle resets. Some mourn the loss of the slower page. Others welcome the new tempo as a sign that the world is awake. You do not have to choose a side to understand the mechanics. The press can now set the day's questions rather than only reflect yesterday's. In the spaces around these machines, communities form that look modern to your eye. Night crews leave the press and share breakfast at dawn. A proofreader sleeps midday. A compositor visits a school to teach a child how to hold a book. A foreman meets with a papermaker to complain about variability in a recent batch. A lawyer drops by with the text of a new law about libel. A novelist argues with an editor about the placement of a cliffhanger at the column's end. The boundaries between trades blur as speed forces collaboration. The point is not romance. The point is mechanism. The city builds a muscle memory for print at pace. You watch schedules tighten further as railways and telegraphs link towns. News can move faster than paper, so the press adjusts by preparing placeholders and frameworks that can accept late-arriving details. Stereotypes are used for stable sections. Live type is held ready for last-minute columns. Staff learn to break and make forms in minutes rather than hours. Some nights are calm, others turn chaotic. The presses still start on time because deliveries must be met or the whole business stumbles. Again, discipline protects the machine from the human urge to dawdle or panic. The iron frame is only a frame. The schedule is the true skeleton. You listen for what you might be missing and hear the old beat in a new drum. Proofing still matters. Page layout still wants balance. Binding still serves use. Readers still write in margins, though now the pencil scratches faster as people read on trains and in cafes. Manuals still sell. Almanacs still mark the year. The new does not abolish the old. It rearranges the old's place in the order of things. You can feel the press insisting not on revolution every day, but on competence every hour. When competence slips, speed will punish. When it holds, speed rewards with a public that trusts the schedule, even when it distrusts some of the words. As you look forward from this iron room, you will see other frames, rotary machines that swallow rolls of paper and spit out folded, cut, and sometimes bound products at rates that make your head spin. Processes that lay ink, not by squeezing paper against raised letters, but by moving color from plate to blanket to sheet in ways that yield even smoother surfaces at even higher speeds. Beyond those, images that replicate without plates at all, cast from light and code. But before you jump, pause and ask the question that connects one era's patience to another's haste. If the press's first gift was consistency and its second gift was pace, what happens to readers' attention when pages multiply beyond counting and arrive not in rooms that smell of oil and hot metal, but on screens that renew themselves without friction, without weight, and without the small delays that once taught patience as a virtue? You come into the composing room at the hour when metal begins to sound like language. The benches are not crowded with small sticks alone. They are lined with hulking keyboards attached to machines that look like something between an organ and a furnace. You recognize the linotype by its posture, a slanted magazine holding matrices, a keyboard that rattles, and a casting mechanism that drops slugs of hot metal, entire lines of type, into a galley that grows heavier with each return of the carriage. The machine's gift is not elegance but throughput. Instead of setting thousands of tiny pieces by hand, the operator taps out a line, watches brass matrices gather, hears molten metal hiss into a mold, and then places the cooling line into a tray. You measure its power in the way a page becomes a collectible object more quickly, not because any genius has arrived, but because a tedious bottleneck has been widened to a steady channel you can keep open for hours. You notice immediately that the linotype is not alone. Across the room, smaller keyboards belong to monotype casters that set type character by character according to punched paper tapes. Monotype favors the work where flexibility matters, mathematics, tables, and jobs with complex corrections, while linotype shines where long rivers of text flow in columns without interruption. Between them sits the old case with its familiar compartments, and you understand that new tools rarely erase old ones. They simply push them into niche roles where their strengths remain. The web of labor around these machines is as precise as their matrices. Operators learn the keyboard not by letters but by the logic of frequently paired characters. Machinists learn to keep pot temperature steady and mold wheels clean. Proofreaders adjust their eyes to spot the special ghosts these machines make. A nicked matrix that repeats a flaw across lines. A worn wedge that distorts a serif in a way that wanders across a column like a faint cough. When you turn from composition to presswork, the room changes scale. The web-fed rotary press dominates, running paper not as individual sheets, but as a continuous ribbon unspooling from heavy rolls mounted at the feeder. The roll, newsprint when the goal is speed and cheapness, threads through turning cylinders where plates curve around the metal like second skin. Here you see the automation of repetition, ink delivered by rollers, dampening managed by careful fountains, impression controlled by pressure that is far more forgiving than human muscle. The press does not wait for you. It runs, and you must be in tempo with it. You watch as the ribbon is printed, cut, folded, and sometimes stitched in one integrated stroke. A ballet of knives and belts and creases that converts flow into units so quickly that it feels like watching time itself being packaged. You feel the invisible work of the plate room feeding this appetite. Stereotypes, cast from papier-mâché or plaster molds taken from a form, become curved plates that strap onto cylinders with clamps that must not slip. Later, electrotypes refine this work when finer detail is needed, but the premise is unchanged. Free the type, save the composition, give the press a durable face. The plate room smells of paste and metal and time saved. The men there are guardians of continuity. If a paper prints an edition every day, they prevent compounding errors by maintaining plate libraries for recurring tables, mastheads, advertisements, and forms. They know where yesterday's stable pieces lie and how to slot today's volatile pieces around them without being seduced into improvisation that risks a missed start. The production floor, which might look like a factory only from a distance, reveals itself to you as a choreographer's score. Copy arrives from editors who have already split text into takes that map to columns. Cutters assign units to linotype operators. Proofs loop through a room where marks are terse and disciplined. Galleys pass to make-up men who arrange columns into pages by the logic of headlines, jumps, and boxes. The page forms receive their furniture and coin pressure. Matrices are returned. Slugs are pied and recast at the end of a run to reclaim metal. Stereotypes are pulled. Plates bolt onto cylinders. The web is threaded. And then the press runs until a call from the front room says enough. Hold for a late wire, strip in a correction, resume. You watch this for a day and understand why the quiet virtues you met in wooden rooms, tidiness, pacing, foresight, have only become more valuable as speeds rose. Not all the work is in the machinery's shadow. One floor up, you find the advertising alley, where people, mostly with pencils and rulers, build pages that will pay for paper. The tasks are repetitive and delicate. They measure agate lines, calculate column inches, fit an advertisement to a space that cannot grow by a hair. And watch for conflicts, a liquor ad that should not face a temperance column, a medicine claim that must be tucked away to reduce complaint, a classified page that needs a structure readers have memorized. You might imagine this is dull beyond words. You would not be wrong. And yet in this monotony lies the health of the enterprise. Without these measurements and placements, the press would be an engine without fuel. If you want to see human resilience measured in pencil nubs, stand here until midnight when a special section must be locked, and no one has the luxury to be precious. The raw materials also teach you the nature of this age. Paper is no longer just rag. Wood pulp, processed by chemical baths and ground to fibers that can be beaten into pulp, lowers cost and increases volume. Its downside, acidity that will turn paper brittle over decades, does not trouble the night crew whose job is to meet the morning. Ink, formulated for speed and legibility, demands a balance. Too stiff, and it will not transfer. Too soft, and it will set off. The press runs hot, not from heat alone, but from friction and attention. Rolls are swapped with flying pastors that join the end of one ribbon to the start of another with an adhesive that must hold its speed. A miscue here means a break, a fluttering flag of paper, a shower of confetti, a red-faced pause while knives stop and cylinders coast. You learn that the disasters you fear most are rarely dramatic. They are small lags in routine that unfold into minutes of repair. When images arrive on the page with text, it is because another craft has joined the dance. Half-tone screens break photographs into dots that your eye reassembles at a distance. Plates carry these patterns to the cylinders. Inking must be balanced to prevent dots from swelling and turning faces to blotches. You run your finger over a printed portrait and feel the illusion of smoothness that is really an army of discrete marks. The men who check these plates are fussy about screens per inch and about registration marks that must align across colors when more than black is used. The reader will never see the registration marks because they live outside the trim, but if they are off, the newsboy's product will look cheap, and the reader's trust in the page will waver in ways he cannot articulate. Again, the caretakers of dull precision guard the larger edifice. The scheduling of distribution grows into a separate intelligence. Editions are zoned. Far towns receive an earlier edition with fewer late-breaking changes. Nearby neighborhoods get a later one with corrections and fresh scores. Bundles leave by truck, rail, and foot in routes that have less to do with geography than with the patience of traffic and the temperament of weather. The loading dock keeps chalk lists that must match the ledgers in the front office and the expectations of the station men 2 towns over. A missed bundle is a grievance that lingers longer than a misprint. Patterns of trust are built as much on arrival as on accuracy. You notice that as the scale grows, the shop becomes a house with many rooms that do not always speak. Composing has its pride. The press crew has its swagger. Advertising has its own rhythms. Circulation speaks a blunt language. Editorial lies by a clock only the Telegraph truly understands. To keep them aligned, a foreman who is neither a tyrant nor a friend walks the aisles, reads faces, and watches gauges. His tools are not wrenches alone. They are the authority to say, "Hold that plate," the nerve to admit a mistake early enough to save 5 minutes later, and the patience to listen to a complaint about a bulky casting machine when all he wants to do is hear the cylinders sing. If you mistaken this for romance, you have not worked a night when the clock wins and the paper is late. The rest of the city runs on schedules that begin to synchronize with this house. Trains leave with mail that includes papers. Factories set whistles by deliveries. Cafes open early because customers will arrive to share headlines. Markets fluctuate in smaller increments because prices appear in rows of numbers printed the same way every day. In this world, repetition is not the enemy. It is the scaffold. You have heard people call the newspapers of this age bland, perhaps. But bland is another word for steady when the task is to deliver the predictable mix, legibility, timeliness, cost, that makes reading a habit and not a feast. When the shift nears its end, you watch the housekeeping that will decide tomorrow's health. Slugs are dumped, metal reclaimed, matrices are cleaned and sorted. Key bars and spacebands get their bath. Rollers are scraped and covered to prevent skinning. Plates to be reused are filed. Plate curves to be scrapped are stacked. Ink fountains are closed and wiped. Pits are swept. Orders for paper are checked against usage. Copy for the next run is inventoried by status. Edited, composed, proofed, plated. This is the least glorious hour and the most essential. The room you leave in order is the room you can command in urgency. If you ever find yourself tempted by the glamour of machines, stand for a while with the crew that closes a room correctly. Their victory is that no one notices they exist. And yet, in the same building or down the street, another development approaches. Plates drawn not from cast molds alone, but from light, chemicals, and film. Lines of text not formed by molten lead, but by photographic exposure. Flats built by paste-up that can be shot to create plates with an economy of effort impossible in hot metal. Cold type, a phrase that will offend hot metal loyalists, edges into the rooms bit by bit. Compositors become paste-up artists. Proofreaders learn to read photographic proofs. The plate room smells of developer and fixer. Processes change, but the old questions remain. Can you keep alignment, maintain legibility, hit the schedule, and prevent errors from breeding in new corners? You feel the hinge as new tools arrive. You hear it in the jokes that hide apprehension. You sense the old virtues trying to find new postures. Before you leave, you listen for the question that the machines themselves seem to murmur as they cool. They have taught the city to keep time in columns. They have hardened habit into expectation. They have pulled reading into a daily reflex for millions of hands. Now, with photography, film, and light entering the page's bloodstream, with letters arriving as lines of exposed dots rather than bodies of metal, the press prepares to shed weight while keeping speed. As you switch off the last slide over the linotype row, an unfinished thought lingers. If light can lift letters out of metal and place them onto plates without casting, what will happen when the letter no longer needs a plate at all? And the page lives first as an arrangement of numbers that can be sent anywhere in the time it takes a cylinder to make a single turn. You enter a pre-press room where the loudest sound is not metal striking metal, but the soft whir of fans over light tables. The smell is chemical, developer in one tray, fixer in another, and the faint tang of adhesive from a layout station where paste-up artists position strips of photo typeset text onto boards. This is not the end of printing. It is a change of state. Type is now light before it becomes ink. Photo typesetting machines expose characters onto film from glass or metal fonts inside the machine, and operators watch green screens that offer codes instead of raw letters. You may miss the clatter of matrices, but you cannot miss the gains. Speed in correction, flexibility in sizing, and a cleanliness that every proofreader notices. The job titles shift, compositor to typesetter to pagination operator. But the discipline of attention remains. Measure, align, check, repeat. You follow a board from paste up to the camera room, where it is shot to make a negative that will contact a plate coated with a light-sensitive emulsion. Exposed, washed and gummed, the plate will transfer its image not by direct contact, but by a trick of surface attraction. Offset lithography does not rely on raised letters or etched depressions. It relies on the fact that oil and water do not mix. The printing surface is flat. Areas that have been exposed and developed accept ink. Non-image areas accept water and reject ink. The inked image transfers first to a rubber blanket cylinder and then from that cylinder to paper. This extra step, offset, seems wasteful until you see what it buys. Even distribution, tolerance of imperfect surfaces and speeds that make a hand press look like a memory from another planet. Offset, especially in web form for newspapers and high-volume magazines, turns the press room into an orchestra pit where color demands its own instruments. Cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. 4 plates, 4 inking systems, 4 fountains, 4 sets of rollers must sing in register. You watch a pressman with a loop examine a color bar at the edge of a sheet, checking dot gain against targets and adjusting ink keys in narrow increments. The sheet that flies by looks the same to you whether the adjustment is made or not. To him, it is the difference between a face that looks human and a face that looks like it slept badly. Densitometers appear on the benches, giving numbers to what used to be judged by eye. The work is the same old prayer to consistency, now prayed with instruments. The supply chain has changed its texture, but not its dependence on coordination. Paper comes on rolls measured not only in inches and pounds, but in caliper and moisture content. Plates arrive from vendors with coatings tuned for fountain solutions that balance pH and conductivity. Inks are delivered in drums, and their tack is logged because a change in one color will lift another if you are not careful. Maintenance has new rituals. Plate cylinders are wiped. Blankets are cleaned or swapped. Fountains are monitored. Chill rollers keep paper from curling after heat. Set ovens drive off solvents in inks for glossy stocks. You think you left the old mechanical fuss behind? You discover you have traded it for new fuss. The reward is pace, clarity, and a quiet reduction in the brutality of force that once bruised type and fatigued arms. Then you step into a room lit by steady light and filled with terminals where layouts appear as pages on screens. PostScript and other page description languages translate shapes and letters into instructions that an image setter uses to paint microscopic dots of light onto film or, later, directly onto plates. The command chain shortens. Typesetting, paste up, and camera merge into pagination and output. For a newspaper, the whole press run's plates can be imaged directly from digital files, computer to plate, eliminating film, shortening cycles, and removing a layer where errors once multiplied. For books, a designer works in a layout program where styles control consistency across chapters, where indexes can regenerate, where widows and orphans can be balanced with a keystroke. You might think this eliminates the need for attention. It does not. It concentrates it. Sloppiness scales faster when you can output a flawed page to 100 plates in an afternoon. Costs and choices rearrange. Small runs become viable. On-demand printing produces a dozen copies that would once have been absurd to set. Color moves from luxury to standard. Photographs reproduce with fidelity unimaginable to half-tone pioneers. Tables flow cleanly across pages whose grids are defined by templates that enforce order without the ruler's daily tyranny. The shop becomes a network. Files travel by wire instead of courier. Proofs appear as PDFs in inboxes. Approvals come back with digital marks. Revisions are logged in version control. Backups are routines, not afterthoughts. The journey from copy to plate, once measured in days of hot work and chemical baths, can now be measured in hours if the people keep their discipline and the servers keep their lights. Meanwhile, printers and publishers discover that the page no longer requires paper to exist at all. The same file that drove a plate setter can drive a screen. At first, that means websites with articles that mimic column logic. It means digital editions of books that preserve pagination or that abandon pagination for flow. It means essays that carry links instead of footnotes. You might expect rupture, but what comes first is imitation. The new medium borrows the habits of the old until it has enough of its own to teach. Gradually, those habits reveal themselves. Scrolling instead of turning, search instead of indexing, sharing instead of lending, comments layered under texts instead of marginalia at the edge, updates made quietly rather than errata sheets tipped into end papers. The virtues you met in earlier rooms, legibility, reliability, timeliness, still rule. They acquire new masks, contrast ratios, responsive design, uptime. The business side, having learned to keep presses fed, learns now to keep servers paid and attention measured. The old accounting lines, ink, paper, wages, maintenance, advertising, gain new partners, bandwidth, storage, subscription management, content delivery networks. The dull virtues have new objects. Maintain your CMS, patch your servers, test your backups, monitor your dashboards, answer your readers. The advertising alley becomes an operations desk where campaigns are placed by code and measured in impressions rather than inches. You may lament the loss of paper's hush. You cannot deny the speed with which a correction can go live or a paragraph can shift to reflect a new fact. This is not judgment. It is a register of capacities. With these capacities come new frailties. The acid in wood pulp paper made 20th century books brittle. The acid of link rot makes 21st century references vanish. Microfilm preserved newspapers in a grey legibility that saved content at the cost of texture. Digitization preserves searchability at the cost of certainty about what was seen when. The correction that once appeared as a small notice on page 2 can now alter a page retroactively, so that yesterday's errors become today's invisibilities. Where earlier readers relied on ownership marks and physical wear to track a text's life, today's readers must rely on timestamps, audit logs, and web archives that are only as diligent as the people who maintain them. The custodianship you met in the guild's rules and the plate room's card files still matters. It has moved to server rooms and scripts. Readers adapt as they always have, by folding the page into the fabric of their days. You hold a phone in one hand and find yourself reading in slivers, a column while a kettle boils, a chapter on a bus, a paragraph between tasks. This is not inferior attention. It is a differently sliced attention. The danger and the promise are two sides of the same page. You can access more than any previous reader in seconds. You can also flee depth with a tap. If you seek the tone of this series, a calm, almost domestic regard for the dull but decisive, consider the housekeeping that keeps your digital reading possible. Battery chemistries, stable, screens calibrated, fonts hinted for clarity at small sizes, servers mirrored, caches warmed, content models coherent. standards agreed upon so letters don't turn to boxes. There is nothing glamorous in that list. There is everything you rely on. In shops that still print, offset holds steady even as digital files feed plates directly. A regional paper images plates at midnight for a 3 a.m. start. A university press schedules a run of an academic monograph with print-on-demand backups. A commercial printer runs millions of flyers one day and a short-run art book the next. The press room's vocabulary is familiar: make ready, spoilage, registration, backup, fold, trim. The newest machines can wash blankets automatically, change plates in minutes, and adjust ink keys under software control. But they still need humans with eyes for the slightly off, with hands that feel a plate's burr, with patience to run a few sheets more to bring a stubborn color into line. It is comforting, perhaps, that this stubbornness lives on. The page, for all its transformations, still resists perfection. You might ask what resilience looks like now that the line between print and digital has blurred. It looks like a library that deacidifies brittle books and scans them while tracking writes. Like a newsroom that stores its layouts and raw text separately to preserve the record of what was printed and what was posted. Like a small press that uses on-demand printing to keep a backlist alive when warehousing would kill it. Like a city that funds a digital archive of local papers with enough redundancy to outlast budget cycles. It looks like unglamorous budgets for maintenance, for documentation, for the middlemen of our time: systems, administrators, archivists, standards committees, whose names never appear on title pages, but whose work keeps title pages meaningful. When you reach for a modern analogy to the old balance of craft, commerce and control, you find it easily. Platforms moderate, publishers curate, regulators legislate, readers organize, creators adapt. The coordinates have moved, but the triangle holds. The reader still wields the quietest power: attention. Attend to a thing and it lives. Starve it and it dies. Printers of the past sought to make the page worthy of that attention by making it legible, regular, and punctual. The makers of today's pages, on paper or on screens, do the same. When they fail, readers drift, and no legal or technical mechanism can conjure devotion. You end with a thought that reaches back through all the rooms you have visited. The printing press, whether made of wood, iron, aluminum, or code, has always rewarded the same muscles: patience, repetition, maintenance, and modesty before the detail. It is easy to praise the inventor. Harder to praise the worker who throws out a stack of smudged sheets so the rest will be clean. Harder still to praise the clerk who keeps permissions in order, the operator who catches a subtle misregistration, the engineer who writes a script to check links for rot at 3 a.m. These are the guardians of the ordinary. Without them, the page, printed or pixelated, becomes noise. And because this series is meant to be a place where you can rest while learning something true, consider the quiet loop that holds through centuries. A page becomes possible when many small acts done well are repeated without applause. A society becomes informed when those pages arrive on time and can be read without strain. The future of print in any form relies less on novelty than on the careful stewardship of habits that seem too boring to mention. They are not boring. They are the reason you can read this line. If you wonder how this story touches your own day, ask yourself what habits of attention and care you will keep when the next tool promises ease. The answer will decide whether the page you hold in your hand or on your screen remains a place where thought can gather and rest.